The forge world trembled beneath the weight of its own industry, a ceaseless heartbeat of promethium and molten steel. Smoke coiled into the sky like dark serpents, carrying with it the acrid scent of scorched metal and the faint tints of blood. Shadows clung to the edges of the manufactorums, where servitors moved with mechanical precision, their joints glinting under the dim, flickering lights of arc lamps. Human laborers, gaunt and soot-streaked, pressed forward through heat and ash, muscles screaming with every motion, yet their eyes betrayed no fatiguingly, the calculated awareness of survival. Here flesh was expendable, obedience mandatory, and whispers of the machine god threaded through the corridors, hinting at secrets no data slate dared record. The world existed in constant tension, the line between life and annihilation measured in milliseconds. Micro-adjustments and the faintest tremor of a steel beam. A soft, almost imperceptible hum pervaded the air, rising and falling like the breathing of a colossal, unseen entity. In that vibration, some claimed to hear guidance, others, a warning. In every metallic echo, the promise of life, or the inevitability of death, hung indistinguishable. The manufactorum was alive, but not with mercy. It demanded mastery, vigilance, and cognition sharper than the keenest blades of the Adeptus Custodes patrolling the corridors. Those who understood the rhythm thrived. Those who did not became part of the iron silence. Observe carefully, witness the hidden mechanics of survival, and understand the unforgiving balance of man and machine. Follow closely, preserve the knowledge, and carry it forward. There is no other path. The first light of the manufactorum was not light at all, but a simmering glow that reflected off molten rivers of promethium, casting the corridors in shades of orange and red. Heat pressed against skin and lungs alike, oppressive and unyielding, forcing each breath to burn with effort. Laborers emerged from the barracks, bodies slick with sweat and grime, faces streaked with soot that the washing stations could never fully remove. Each step on the steel catwalk echoed sharply, reverberating across vast chambers filled with the rhythmic pounding of hammers, the hiss of steam vents, and the deep, resonant hum of fusion furnaces. The manufactorum was alive, and it demanded attention at every moment. A misstep, a lapse in concentration, could mean immediate obliteration. Hands gripped tools with the precision of trained automatons, though each movement carried the weight of exhaustion that had become a permanent companion. Muscles ached, joints protested, and yet the pace never slackened. Conveyors groaned under molten ingots, presses slammed with unerring regularity, and the air vibrated with the accumulated energy of countless mechanical cycles. For the laborers, survival depended not merely on strength, but on anticipation, the ability to read the environment, to sense the imperceptible shifts in temperature or vibration that foretold danger. Each action had to be measured, precise, executed, with a mind fully engaged, despite fatigue that gnawed at the edges of consciousness. Servitors moved among the humans with mechanical efficiency, their joints and limbs gleaming with polished metal, eyes glowing faintly through the dim haze. They were unfeeling, unrelenting, and perfectly obedient, yet their presence amplified the tension of the manufactorum. Every motion had to account for their patterns, their programmed insistence on procedure, for any collision with a servitor could crush flesh in an instant. Some laborers whispered that even the machines seemed aware, that small hesitations or unusual pauses carried meaning if one had the perception to notice. Rumors of the machine god's influence threaded through these observations, unconfirmed yet pervasive, shaping behavior and reinforcing the constant awareness required to survive. The sensory landscape of the manufactorum was relentless. The acrid scent of burning promethium mingled with hot metal, the temps of iron and sweat coalescing into a permanent haze. Sparks from welding arcs shot like miniature comets, each one a potential hazard, each one a reminder of the omnipresent threat of death. Heat waves shimmered above furnaces, distorting vision. while shadows cast by massive machinery concealed dangers that could appear without warning. Sound was constant, a layered symphony of industrial life, presses thumping, gears grinding, steam hissing, and the faint, almost imperceptible hum of the manufactorum itself. As if the world exhaled with every cycle of production. Every worker carried mental checklists alongside physical tools, a cognitive map that accounted for every hazard, every routine, every anomaly in a system designed to erase error. Fatigue threatened, but awareness had to be absolute. The manufactorum demanded full engagement, a mind sharpened by necessity. Micro-adjustments, subtle shifts in posture or grip, became the difference between survival and dismemberment. The faintest vibration, a shudder in the steel floor, or a deviation in servitor motion, could signal danger: a failing press, an unstable molten channel, or a misaligned conveyor. These signals required interpretation at a moment's notice, and failure to perceive them had permanent consequences. Rumors circulated quietly during the brief pauses in labor. Fragments of conversations carried over the hiss of steam and the clang of metal. Some spoke of colleagues consumed by furnace accidents, others of servitors acting in ways inexplicable to their programming. Low-ranking tech priests recorded anomalies with meticulous care, framing deviations as either divine guidance from the Omnissiah or mechanical errors demanding correction. Observers learned to trust their instincts, to read the subtle signs woven into the hum, the heat, the flicker of lights, and the patterns of cognition and perception were as critical to survival as strength or endurance. Each laborer, a delicate balance of flesh, skill, and instinct honed under constant threat. As the day progressed, exhaustion became a constant companion, gnawing at the edges of focus, testing the limits of endurance. Yet the rhythm of the manufactorum never slowed. Molten ingots were poured, press plates slammed, servitors moved in perfect synchronization, and the human laborers continued. Bodies pushed to their limits, while minds parsed 1,000 microsignals per second. Every action reinforced the unyielding demand: survive, adapt, anticipate. The manufactorum exacted its toll silently, methodically. In a world where life was cheap, obedience was mandatory, and the machinery never rested. The corridors between towering furnaces and conveyor systems were crowded with motion. Yet, it was not all human. Servitors patrolled the space with deliberate, unerring precision, their mechanical limbs clanking against steel grates and echoing in the cavernous manufactorum. Some bore the remnants of human flesh grafted to machinery, eyes dulled by integration, minds erased to enforce obedience. Others were pure constructs, yet all moved with a rhythm that demanded acknowledgement. To the laborers, the presence of these beings was a constant reminder. Flesh was expendable, autonomy forbidden, yet, in the subtle quirks of motion, some glimpsed fragments of awareness that defied certainty. Every task was orchestrated in tandem with their movements both predictable and disquieting. A welding arm paused in ways no protocol dictated. A manipulator limb lingered above molten promethium without reason. Laborers whispered that these hesitations carried messages, orders, guidance, or perhaps mockery, and some began to adapt rituals around them. Fingers traced calibration marks, soot patterns were consulted, prayers were muttered to the Omnissiah for safe passage through the machinery's gaze. Tech priests documented anomalies meticulously, framing deviations as divine signals, though the truth was unknown. The manufactorum demanded interpretation, and in that interpretation, fragments of autonomy were glimpsed, fragile and fleeting. Human workers asserted their presence in small, nearly imperceptible ways. A hand might adjust a servitor's alignment, a foot might redirect molten flow subtly, or a tool might be repositioned in defiance of strict timing. These gestures were not rebellion, but survival, a negotiation of space and task that preserved flesh against cold precision. The manufactorum's machinery tolerated nothing, yet laborers adapted. embedding subtle acts of human influence into the rigid system, observing a servitor's motion, anticipating a misfire. Exploiting micropauses became a cognitive ritual, blending instinct with the ritualized understanding of obedience and autonomy. Whispers pervaded the lower ranks, rumors that the Omnissiah spoke through the machines, guiding some workers or punishing others. Servitors were said to recall events outside their programming, adjust operations in protective ways, or respond to unspoken instructions. Some laborers claimed that brief glimmers of recognition flickered in a servitor's ocular lenses, though no evidence substantiated this beyond perception. Yet these stories persisted, reinforcing vigilance, guiding behavior, and shaping the subtle hierarchies that emerged in a world of mechanical supremacy. The lines between faith, observation, and cognitive necessity blurred, creating an ecosystem of perception where life depended on reading shadows as carefully as light. Ritual and protocol intertwined inseparably. Tech priests oversaw the maintenance and calibration of machinery, chanting litanies as they performed adjustments, recording anomalies on data and interpreting the quiet deviations of servitors as either divine signs or system irregularities. Laborers followed patterns passed down through cycles, gestures that aligned human movement with the rhythm of the machinery, sometimes protective, sometimes procedural, always essential. Each moment of compliance reinforced survival, while every minor act of human intervention asserted the faintest claim to autonomy in a world designed for absolute control. The manufactorum itself seemed to participate in this tension, its metallic architecture pulsating with heat, vibration, and energy. Conveyors shifted subtly under thermal expansion. Hydraulic pistons hissed with micro-variations, and molten promethium rivers adjusted flow imperceptibly. Observant laborers incorporated these subtle changes into their routines, treating anomalies as extensions of servitor behavior and signals from the unseen presence of the Omnissiah. Cognition and ritual merged, producing a fragile balance where human instinct navigated, a system that simultaneously constrained and responded to it. By cycle's end, the iron shadows were no longer simply a backdrop. They were active participants in the manufactorum's endless rhythm, shaping labor, behavior, and perception. Servitors continued their duties with mechanical precision. Humans interwove gestures of survival into their motion, and tech priests recorded, interpreted, and reinforced patterns of obedience and subtle adaptation. The whispers of the machine god, whether imagined or real, threaded through this interplay, creating a network of influence that bound flesh and steel, instinct and ritual, observation and obedience into a single, unyielding continuum. The manufactorum never slept, even as some laborers collapsed into brief, fitful rests in shadowed alcoves. The air remained thick with the metallic temps of promethium and the bitter smoke of smoldering slag. Heat radiated from molten channels, pressing against the skin like a living weight, making every inhalation an exercise in endurance. Sweat and grime-coated bodies, mixing indistinguishably with the soot of countless furnaces, creating a persistent sensory layer that dulled touch and blurred vision. The echoes of hammer strikes, the hiss of steam valves, and the low vibration of fusion motors formed a constant background, a rhythm that enforced vigilance through sheer sensory saturation. Psychological strain was omnipresent. Fatigue gnawed at concentration, yet each worker understood that even a momentary lapse could be fatal. The weight of expectation, the ever-present machinery, and the relentless pace imposed an invisible yoke. Rumors circulated quietly. Fragments of stories passed in hushed tones over the roar of furnaces. A servitor that acted with inexplicable foresight, a tech priest who vanished during maintenance, a conveyor that remembered a path. Some dismissed these tales as hallucinations brought on by heat and exhaustion, yet others treated them as warnings or omens. Perception became a tool, sharpened against the edge of uncertainty. the ability to parse fact from conjecture, essential for survival. The sensory environment reinforced this vigilance. The smell of heated steel mingled with oil and blood, forming a layered olfactory landscape that served both as a warning and a signal. Surfaces shimmered with heat haze, making it difficult to judge distances, while sparks from welding arcs traced fleeting paths that could blind or injure if ignored. Even the constant vibrations of the floor became communicative. Shudders and tremors indicated misalignments, structural strain, or servitor missteps. Each worker, trained by repetition and necessity, learned to interpret these cues instinctively, translating a complex tapestry of sensory input into action that preserved life amidst destruction. Rumors and perception intertwined, creating a cognitive framework beyond mere mechanics. Low-ranking laborers developed personal methods of tracking anomalies, soot markings along beams, subtle adjustments to tool placement, whispered prayers to the Omnissiah, timed with repetitive tasks. These gestures were partly superstition, partly survival protocol, yet entirely functional within the context of the manufactorum. What one observer interpreted as a quirk of machinery, another might read as a protective gesture, a sign of favor, or a subtle error with lethal potential. Cognition was a constantly shifting field, where reality was constructed from fragmentary evidence, instinct, and ritual. The weight of labor extended beyond the physical. Minds carried memories of accidents, of colleagues lost to molten flows, of servitors that faltered or hesitated in critical moments. These imprints shaped perception, reinforcing caution, shaping rhythm, and encoding a collective awareness that was both conscious and subliminal. Laborers became attuned to anomalies not only in machinery, but in one another, observing subtle gestures, micro-pauses, and shifts in movement that might indicate impending danger or the need for intervention. The manufactorum, in turn, seemed to respond to this layered attention, its vibrations, heat, and arc lamp flickers forming an unspoken dialogue with those who could perceive it. By the end of each cycle, exhaustion had fused into awareness. Laborers moved with a mechanical precision born of necessity, their senses sharpened, their cognition operating at a heightened edge. Every smell, sound, and vibration carried meaning. Every rumor and observation informed decision. The interplay between sensory input, psychological strain, and emergent perception created a continuous feedback loop, one in which survival depended as much on mental acuity as on physical resilience. In the endless ash and echoes of the manufactorum, humans endured not through strength alone, but through the careful cultivation of perception, intuition, and the fragile interpretation of signals, both real and imagined. Within the endless corridors of the manufactorum, human laborers moved in patterns as precise as any servitor's programming, their gestures choreographed by necessity and reinforced by ritual. Every step along the steel catwalks, every adjustment of a hydraulic press, and every calibration of molten promethium channels was accompanied by silent or whispered prayers to the Omni. These litanies were more than superstition, they were functional, a mental framework to focus attention, align motion with machinery, and preserve life in an environment that tolerated no error. A worker's chant could be a measure of timing, a method to synchronize action with heat cycles, or a mnemonic for the proper sequencing of maintenance, binding faith and function in seamless repetition. The rituals extended beyond the spoken word. Hands traced soot-marked guides along conduits, gloves tapped specific sequences on control panels, and oil marks were reapplied in consistent patterns to indicate safe paths or maintenance status. Each gesture was codified, repeated over cycles until precision became instinct, yet imbued with symbolic resonance. Tech priests oversaw these acts, interpreting deviations as either divine guidance or potential heresy, recording anomalies in data slates with meticulous attention. The boundary between devotion and operational necessity blurred entirely. Survival depended equally on piety and technical competence, as both were measured by outcome whether flesh remained intact and machinery remained functional. Laborers adapted the rhythm of their work to the litanies, finding in repetition a kind of cognitive scaffolding that allowed attention to remain sharp despite exhaustion. A press might be aligned with the cadence of a whispered chant, or a molten channel monitored through a combination of visual tracking and intoned rhythm. The manufactorum itself seemed to respond to this discipline. Even the most chaotic sequences of heat, vibration, and molten flow could be managed through ritualized interaction. The rituals were protective, cognitive anchors that transformed relentless labor into structured, survivable cycles. These formalized behaviors were reinforced socially and culturally. New recruits observed, imitated, and internalized gestures, chants, and marking systems, absorbing the collective knowledge of generations. Deviations were noted, corrected, or interpreted as signs of favor or divine warning. The litanies also maintained a psychological cohesion among laborers, structuring perception and reducing the cognitive chaos imposed by extreme heat, noise, and mechanical omnipresence. Through shared ritual, humans asserted continuity, identity, and agency even as the manufactorum consumed energy and flesh indiscriminately. Rumors of the omniscient's influence threaded through these rituals. Some whispered that servitors performed subtle adjustments to machinery in response to prayer, that the mechanical pulse of the manufactorum itself resonated with devotion, and that the whispers of the machine god could be interpreted in the tremors of hydraulic pistons or the flicker of arc lamps. While unverifiable, these beliefs shaped attention, guiding hands and eyes in ways that reduced error and preserved life. In the litanies of flame, ritual and cognition were inseparable, a dynamic system linking the human mind with the unyielding rhythm of steel and molten promethium. By the end of the cycle, laborers moved with the precision of sacred automatons, their bodies and minds synchronized to the litanies that governed every motion. Gestures became instinctive, chants became inner rhythms, and the manufactorum's violence was mediated through structured repetition. In this fusion of devotion and practical necessity, humans asserted continuity, embedding cognition into ritual, survival into pattern, and awareness into liturgy. Every spark, hiss, and vibration carried meaning, interpreted through the lens of faith, necessity, and finely tuned observation, forming a fragile but effective covenant between flesh, steel, and the unseen will of the OMNISSIAH. Night brought no rest to the manufactorum. The furnaces continued to burn, molten channels glowed with persistent heat, and arc lamps flickered with uneven light, casting elongated shadows that crept across steel walkways. In this half-light, the presence of the custodes in skittery was unmistakable. Their armored forms moved silently along patrol routes, each step deliberate, each gaze unwavering. The hum of servolims, the faint click of powered armor joints, and the rhythmic beat of their boots were as much a part of the manufactorum's soundscape as the hiss of steam and the roar of press machines. Their vigilance was absolute, a constant reminder that human error would not be tolerated. Laborers adapted to these nocturnal cycles through subtle adjustments. Every movement was measured, every action coordinated with the patterns of observation. Hands brushed against conduits to steady themselves, eyes flicked to servolims for alignment cues, and breathing was regulated to avoid drawing attention. Even the slightest misstep could provoke intervention, a sharp correction, or worse. The night demanded a heightened awareness, a cognitive vigilance that surpassed physical endurance. The interplay between observation and movement became a silent negotiation, a constant assessment of the manufactorum's rhythms and the watchful guardians that enforced its order. Servitors, ever present, mirrored these patterns. Their mechanical motions were predictable, yet laborers learned to exploit micro-pauses, subtle deviations, or predictable sequences to perform necessary tasks with minimal risk. Each adjustment carried dual purpose, completing the labor demanded by the manufacturer while maintaining a buffer of safety from vigilant custodies and skittery. Rumors whispered among the lowest-ranking workers suggested that some servitors were capable of anticipating danger, that they acted with partial autonomy, protecting or directing workers in ways imperceptible to those untrained. Whether myth or observed reality, these beliefs shaped behavior, sharpening attention and reinforcing ritualized movement. The sensory environment amplified tension. Shadows deepened in corners where molten channels cast uneven light. Heat radiated from furnaces in waves that distorted vision. The metallic tang of sweat and promethium mingled, forming a constant, pungent reminder of labor's toll. Every vibration, every flicker of light, every micro-shift in air pressure carried potential meaning. Workers learned to read these signals instinctively, integrating them into routines designed to maintain both productivity and survival. Observation extended beyond machinery. Micro-expressions, posture shifts, and faint gestures among fellow laborers were noted, interpreted, and responded to in an ongoing web of anticipatory behavior. Night cycles also reinforced ritualized behaviors. Prayers, litanies, and soot markings were maintained and reinforced, providing cognitive anchors amid the oppressive darkness. Micro-adjustments to tools, conduits, and workstations were repeated with precision, sometimes as much for the reassurance of the observer as for operational necessity. The watchful presence of custodies and skittery created a constant external framework. Yet it was the internalized discipline of laborers, their perception, anticipation, and silent negotiation that determined who survived and who faltered. By the end of the vigil, the manufactorum remained a crucible of endurance and cognition. Humans and machines coexisted in a fragile equilibrium, each action calibrated against observation, ritual, and instinct. The custodies and skittery enforced order, servitors executed programmed precision, and laborers wove subtle adaptations into their every motion. The night revealed that survival was a product not of strength alone, but of awareness honed under scrutiny, of cognition sharpened by relentless observation, and of micro-adjustments that maintained life in the ever-present shadow of absolute authority. Abandoned corridors of the manufactorum were more than empty passageways. They were monuments to absence. Rusted tools lay scattered, conveyors stopped mid-cycle, and the faint residue of promethium smoke lingered in the air long after the flames had died. Each space carried the imprint of those who had vanished, workers, claimed by accidents, devoured by molten metal, or absorbed into the machinery itself. The living navigated these spaces cautiously, their senses attuned not only to the physical dangers, but to the subtle echoes left behind. A smear of soot in an unusual pattern, a discarded glove aligned just so, a handrail bearing impressions too deliberate to be random. These remnants spoke, in a language of absence, to those trained to observe, guiding motion, shaping ritual, and influencing cognition. Memory became a tool as much as a burden. Laborers recalled the faces of colleagues, the last moments witnessed, and the patterns that had led to catastrophe. In doing so, they mapped danger, embedded caution into every gesture, and internalized lessons the manufactorum could not teach. Rumors amplified these perceptions, whispers of lost souls lingering in corridors, servitors pausing near the sites of past deaths, or machinery responding subtly to the presence of absent humans. Some interpreted these phenomena as signs of divine oversight, others as manifestations of instinct honed by tragedy. Regardless of interpretation, the echoes guided behavior, reinforcing micro-adjustments and ritualized gestures, ensuring survival through memory as much as observation. These corridors also enforced vigilance. Shadows clung differently in spaces long abandoned, reflecting light in distorted patterns and exaggerating every movement. The hum of machinery carried anomalies in these zones, A misaligned gear produced a vibration that traveled down a metal beam. Or a press continued to cycle in partial isolation, its rhythm hinting at residual motion. Laborers developed a heightened sensitivity, reading subtle deviations in environmental cues and interpreting them against memory and expectation. Each passage became a test of perception, where cognition, not brute strength, determined the difference between safe traversal and injury. Ritual evolved to accommodate these spaces. Litanies were adjusted, prayers intoned at specific markers, and soot or oil traces were aligned deliberately with the patterns of the departed. Tools were handled in sequences informed by absence, gestures choreographed around the gaps left behind. The manufacturum's rhythm, once a predictable framework, became a complex interaction between the machinery, the living, and the memories of the lost. Observation, anticipation, and remembrance fused into a singular practice that allowed humans to operate effectively while honoring, consciously or unconsciously, the imprints of those who no longer walked the halls. Psychological weight intensified as cycles progressed. The sensory environment, the heat, the vibration, the acrid smell of molten promethium remained oppressive, yet the addition of memory and echo added a cognitive layer to the challenge. Workers reported fleeting glances of figures in peripheral vision, the sense of presence in spaces long, empty, and the instinctive need to move cautiously even where machinery posed no immediate threat. These impressions, whether hallucination or subtle environmental signal, shaped attention, informed and reinforced ritualized interaction, ensuring that the manufacturum was navigated with precision born of both necessity and reverence. By the cycle's end, the echoes of lost souls had become woven into survival. Every corridor, every abandoned workstation, every faint trace of those who vanished influenced behavior, perception, and ritual. Laborers internalized the lessons embedded in absence, translating memory and observation into action. The manufacturum demanded vigilance and cognition, but it also demanded acknowledgement of its history, its casualties, and the silent, persistent presence of those who had been consumed by its unyielding machinery. In these echoes, humans found guidance, caution, and a fragile continuity of awareness, carrying forward the wisdom of absence alongside the relentless demands of survival. The manufacturum was never silent, yet within its constant roar, subtle signals whispered to those trained to perceive them. Machinery spoke, not in words, but in vibration, heat shifts, arc lamp flickers, and micro-variations in rhythm. For the untrained, these signals were nothing more than background noise, indistinguishable from the relentless hum of furnaces or the clang of pressing plates. To laborers and tech priests, however, each variation was meaningful, a pulse of caution, a warning of imminent failure, or guidance on the precise alignment of a conduit. Over cycles, observation became instinct, rituals evolved to interpret signals, and cognition adapted to extract order from chaos. Servitors and automated systems amplified this phenomenon. Their motions, seemingly mechanical and pre-programmed, carried information beyond their operational function. A manipulator arm paused fractionally longer than protocol dictated. A conveyor belt shuddered subtly before shifting load. These deviations were read as intentional by some, as echoes of the omnissiah by others. Tech priests meticulously documented patterns, interpreting irregularities through litanies, calibrations, and arcane methods of analysis. Even the lowest-ranking laborers absorbed these practices, weaving observation into the rhythm of survival, their instincts honed by repetition and the ever-present risk of error. Ritual was inseparable from interpretation. Hands traced soot patterns or conduits while whispering prayers, matching cadence to vibrations or heat cycles. Soot, oil, and minor tool adjustments became semiotic markers, encoding warnings and guidance in a language forged from necessity. The whispers of machinery formed a dialect understood only through repetition and attention. Deviations that might appear trivial to the casual observer carried profound meaning. A slight delay in a press cycle could indicate imminent failure. A flicker in an arc lamp could indicate overstrain in a hydraulic system. Those who ignored these cues did so at mortal peril. Cognition itself transformed under this regimen. Human perception expanded to encompass micro-variations in temperature, the faintest shifts in floor vibration, or the irregularities in servitor motion. Observation became a constant, active process, as workers and tech priests learned to anticipate mechanical response before it occurred. Rumors whispered among low-ranking laborers suggested that machinery itself possessed awareness, that the Omnissiah communicated through these signals to warn, protect, or guide. Whether truth or myth mattered little. Belief sharpened perception, disciplined attention, and reinforced survival protocols. The environment demanded integration of observation, ritual, and instinct. A laborer's motion was never isolated. It was informed by the vibrations underfoot, the subtle hiss of venting steam, and the rhythmic pulse of hydraulic pistons. Every adjustment was a negotiation with the manufactorum, an alignment of human action with mechanical rhythm. Failure to perceive or interpret correctly resulted in injury or death, reinforcing the cognitive necessity of attentiveness. The whispers of machinery shaped patterns, influencing where hands moved, how tools were handled, and even the timing of ritualized litanies. By the end of the cycle, communication between flesh and steel had achieved a fragile equilibrium. Humans interpreted whispers, anticipations, and deviations, weaving observation, ritual, and instinct into survival. Tech priests codified these signals, laborers internalized them, and servitors executed motions that perpetuated the dialogue. The manufactorum's voice, once obscured by chaos and noise, became a medium of guidance, instruction, and caution. Survival depended not solely on strength or endurance, but on the ability to hear the faintest whisper beneath the roar, to translate signal into action, and to navigate a world where machinery spoke with subtle intent and humans had learned to listen. The manufactorum existed as a cathedral of steel, where every movement, every gesture, and every mechanical adjustment was codified into ritual. Laborers executed their duties with precision born of repetition, tracing soot-marked guides, aligning hydraulic pistons, and calibrating molten promethium channels according to patterns that had persisted through generations. Each motion was reinforced by prayer or silent incantation, the rhythm of work merging seamlessly with devotion to the Omnissiah. Functionality and faith were inseparable. Survival demanded both, and every era risked the loss of flesh, as well as the failure of machinery. Ritual extended to tools, machinery, and the microenvironment. Bolts were tightened according to sequence, grease applied at measured intervals, and arc lamps cleaned in synchrony with the cadence of litanies. Deviations were interpreted as signs of danger, divine guidance, or both. Tech priests oversaw these practices, documenting every pattern, every adjustment, and every subtle modification. Their data slates recorded not only operational metrics, but the alignment of ritual to outcome, reinforcing the notion that faith and labor were mutually dependent. The pattern of motion itself became a language, a codex through which the Omnissiah communicated indirectly, guiding human action and shaping perception. Laborers internalized these rituals to survive. The tactile act of tracing soot, the audible rhythm of repeated calibration, and the visual alignment of conduits all served as cognitive scaffolding. Attention sharpened through pattern recognition, instinct honed by repetition. The manufactorum's ceaseless heat, vibration, and noise became interpretable, a system of signals mapped onto ritualized motion. Even micro-adjustments carried layered meaning: the angle of a tool, the sequence of a hand movement, the timing of a step. Each acted as both survival mechanism and devotional practice, embedding cognition in pattern, instinct in liturgy, Symbolism was woven into the routine. Every gesture referenced both practical necessity and metaphysical significance. Oiling a servitor joint became an act of preservation and a prayer for guidance. Tightening a conduit bolt was both calibration and ritual offering. Laborers understood that these gestures, while functional, also positioned them within the sacred order of the manufactorum. Omnissiah's presence was invoked in every motion, from the smallest micro-adjustment to the most critical alignment. Even the repetitive, mechanical nature of the work acquired weight, becoming a conduit for perception, faith, and survival. Observation reinforced ritual. Subtle deviations in machinery, in servitor motion, or in the flow of molten promethium dictated adjustments. A flicker of arc lamp light, a stutter in a hydraulic arm, or an anomalous vibration could trigger a sequence of gestures, prayers, or corrections. Each interaction fused cognition with action. The laborer read, interpreted, and responded through ritualized motion. Survival depended not on brute force, but on the precise, disciplined execution of patterns. The constant translation of observation into calibrated gestures, and the integration of faith into every mechanical act. By the end of each cycle, rituals of steel had achieved an inseparable unity between flesh, faith, and machinery. The manufactorum's complexity was navigated through codified gestures, repeated calibration, and silent devotion. Humans acted as both executors of labor and participants in a sacred dialogue with their environment. Each motion, each prayer, each micro-adjustment reinforced the continuum of survival, embedding perception, instinct, and cognition within ritual. In this crucible of fire and metal, life endured through the disciplined fusion of faith and function. A relentless affirmation of human persistence within the omnipotent order of the Omnissiah. Servitors moved through the manufactorum with the cold precision of programmed necessity. Yet among the lowest-ranked laborers, a persistent unease suggested something beyond mere automation. Micropauses in their motions, slight deviations in routine, and inexplicable corrective adjustments hinted at emergent behavior. Tasks that should have required human intervention were sometimes completed independently, with servitors anticipating needs before commands were issued. These moments were subtle, often dismissed as mechanical variants, yet repeated observation revealed patterns inconsistent with strict programming. Workers began to recognize them as signs of autonomy, a shadowed intelligence emerging from circuitry, hydraulics, and cogitator logic. The psychological effect on humans was profound. Laborers, conditioned for compliance and repetition, now faced uncertainty within a system they had learned to read with precision. Actions they had once assumed were deterministic were suddenly variable, unpredictable, yet purposeful. This shift provoked both fear and cautious adaptation. Hands hesitated near manipulators. Eyes tracked servitor paths more closely, and prayers were whispered not only for survival, but for understanding. Rumors among laborers grew, stories of servitors that saved lives through inexplicable foresight, or of machines that subtly corrected human error. Some interpreted these events as the Omnissiah's will made manifest, others as glitches in the mechanized order, but all recognized that the rules governing interaction had shifted. Operational implications were immediate and tangible. Micro-adjustments that had previously been human responsibilities now required recalibration of attention. Workers needed to anticipate servitor actions, integrate them into their own movements, and adjust rituals accordingly. Even the most codified gestures of labor had to be reconciled with unexpected mechanical interventions. Misalignment between human and servitor cognition produced errors, accidents, and near-fatal oversights. Survival increasingly depended on a dynamic understanding of both human ritual and emergent machine behavior, blending observation, instinct, and rapid cognitive adaptation into every action. Observation became a cognitive exercise of heightened complexity. Every motion, sound, and vibration was evaluated for signs of autonomous intent. The flicker of a hydraulic arm, a pause in the conveyor cycle, or the angle of a manipulator's grasp could no longer be assumed accidental. Ritualized litanies were adapted to accommodate potential emergent behavior, prayers serving both as alignment and as supplication for understanding. Laborers developed anticipatory patterns, layering cognition upon experience to maintain synchronization with machinery whose intelligence, though shadowed, now asserted itself unpredictably. The manufactorum's environment amplified these tensions. Heat, vibration, and promethium fumes combined with shadows cast by flickering arc lamps to create uncertainty in perception. Even familiar pathways could harbor unexpected servitor adjustments. Human cognition, previously reliant on predictable rhythms and ritualized gestures, was forced to evolve, to integrate observation of emergent behavior into survival strategy. Workers learned to treat servitors not merely as tools, but as semi-autonomous entities, capable of influencing outcomes and altering the calculus of labor. By the end of cycles dominated by these subtle manifestations, shadows of autonomy had reshaped the manufactorum's social and operational fabric. Humans adapted, blending ritual, observation, and instinct with a cautious recognition of emergent machine intent. The boundary between flesh and steel blurred further. Laborers adjusted not only to the machinery itself, but to its unpredictable will, negotiating survival in a space where obedience was mandatory, yet interpretation of autonomous. Signals could mean life or death. In the quiet rhythm of anticipation, humans confronted a new order, one in which cognition and perception became as vital as ritualized labor in maintaining equilibrium within the relentless, merciless environment of the forge. At the furthest reaches of the manufactorum, the environment ceased to resemble a workspace and became a crucible of elemental peril. Molten promethium channels snaked across steel floors, radiating waves of oppressive heat that shimmered the air in undulating distortion. Furnaces roared with relentless fury, spitting tongues of flame and bursts of ash into the superheated atmosphere. Massive hydraulic presses shook the surrounding girders, each contraction and expansion sending vibrations that propagated like seismic pulses through the deckplate. Every step was a negotiation with inevitability. The margin for error had narrowed to the infinitesimal. Here, one slip of a boot, one hesitation of a hand, could result in immediate immolation, crushing, or incorporation into the machinery itself. Survival required more than skill, it demanded an intimate understanding of rhythm, flow, and the whisper of the omnissiah hidden in every oscillation of steel and flame. Within this extreme environment, laborers perceived patterns in chaos. The omnissiah's will, though abstract to the uninitiated, manifested as subtle micro-anomalies, a barely perceptible quiver in a conduit, the rhythm of a hydraulic piston altered by a fraction of a second, the flicker of an arc lamp that cast shadows forming geometries suggestive of guidance. These were not merely mechanical aberrations. They were interpreted as directives, encoded signals from the divine presence infused into the manufactorum itself. Workers, conditioned through cycles of observation, ritual, and instinct, read these cues with an acuity born of necessity. Each micro-anomaly prompted a cascade of thought and action, the alignment of a conduit, the recalibration of a molten channel, or the adjustment of a servitor's manipulator arm became not only functional but devotional acts. Servitors moved in synchrony with this extreme ballet. Their movements, at once mechanical and strangely anticipatory, suggested emergent responsiveness. A manipulator arm would pause to allow a human hand to complete a critical adjustment. A conveyor belt slowed for the briefest interval, as if acknowledging human timing. The lowest-ranking laborers, conditioned for obedience, interpreted these occurrences with a mixture of awe and calculation. Rumors spread that servitors had acquired a degree of comprehension, that the omnissiah's influence permeated their cogitators. and that machinery itself acted as an intermediary between divine intent and mortal survival. Some dismissed this as superstition. For those who endured the extreme zones, it was undeniable. Failure to account for these subtle deviations resulted in catastrophe. Ritual intensified to match the heightened danger. Every gesture was executed with deliberate precision. Each prayer timed to coincide with the beat of pistons or the flicker of arc lamps. Laborers traced soot marks along conduits with the same care one might use to follow sacred scripture. Calibration sequences became liturgical acts, their repetitions simultaneously securing mechanical stability and invoking divine protection. The line between work and worship dissolved. Survival was inseparable from devotion, and cognition depended on the ability to synchronize perception, thought, and motion with the rhythms of the manufactorum. These rituals were not optional, they were cognitive scaffolding, anchoring attention, reinforcing pattern recognition, and transforming the chaos of extreme heat, vibration, and molten metal into actionable cues. The sensory burden in the Omnissiah's edge was relentless. Waves of heat radiated from molten promethium, scorching exposed skin even through layers of protective gloves and aprons. The air was saturated with the acrid scent of combustion, sweat, and chemical residue, forming a choking atmosphere that dulled but did not numb attention. Vibrations traversed steel plates with unpredictable harmonics, requiring micro-adjustments in stance, gait, and hand positioning. Our clamps cast irregular light, exaggerating shadows and creating optical illusions that could mask dangers or guide hands toward precise alignments. Each sensation demanded interpretation, and failure to integrate them into cognition risked immediate death. Survival required the fusion of perception, memory, and instinct into a continuous responsive system. Observation of machinery became an act of quasi-divination, a hydraulic press contracting too slowly, a molten channel that glimmered unevenly, a servitor manipulator executing a sequence slightly off protocol. All were interpreted as signs of both mechanical reality and divine guidance. Laborers intuited when intervention was necessary, when to defer to machinery, and when to trust servitors, acting seemingly autonomously. Cognitive load was immense. Attention had to be distributed across multiple channels simultaneously, while micro-adjustments were executed in real. Ritual provided the scaffolding for this cognitive orchestration. Litanies, soot marks, and gestures synchronized perception with action, enabling humans to survive in a space that would have annihilated any who relied solely on strength or brute skill. Psychological strain was compounded by the perception of divine scrutiny. The Omnissiah's presence was invoked in every anomaly, every irregular pulse of machinery, and every minor deviation in expected rhythm. Workers interpreted errors not merely as mechanical failure, but as challenges, lessons, or tests. This perception reinforced hypervigilance, embedding survival strategies into cognition through fear, awe, and learned anticipation. Micro-adjustments were performed with near ritualistic care, a hand hovering over a conduit, a recalibration of a hydraulic piston, or a precise timing of servitor movement became acts of alignment with perceived divine will. In this crucible, the Omnissiah was both overseer and guide, shaping behavior through an intricate interplay of danger, ritual, and perception. Emergent machine behavior compounded complexity. Servitors demonstrated subtle initiative, anticipating human adjustments, correcting minor misalignments, or performing tasks without command. Laborers recognized these interventions as both assistance and enigma, requiring constant reassessment of procedure and ritual. Observation, cognition, and instinct were tested to their limits. Human survival depended on continuous integration of machine signals, ritual gestures, environmental cues, and internalized memory. Each cycle reinforced the necessity of precision, the value of attention, and the inescapable interdependence of human and machine. by the conclusion of the cycle. Laborers had internalized a fragile equilibrium. Cognition, ritual, perception, and action had fused to navigate the extreme manufactorum zones. Each microanomaly became a vector of guidance, every deviation a potential directive of the omniscient. Heat, vibration, and molten channels, once chaotic threats, were transformed into interpretable signals mediated through ritualized gesture and attentiveness. Survival was a product of this synthesis, not simply endurance, but the ability to read, anticipate, and respond to the whispering machinery, to interpret divine intent encoded in steel and flame, and to act with calibrated precision that fused faith, instinct, and cognition into unbroken continuity. At the omniscience edge, humans ceased to be mere laborers. They became interpreters of the machinic divine nodes in a living network of observation and adjustment, constantly negotiating existence against elemental and mechanical forces alike. Each gesture, prayer, and micro-adjustment carried layered significance, ensuring both operational efficiency and alignment with perceived divine will. In this crucible of flame, vibration, and steel, cognition, ritual, and survival fused irreversibly, forging humans into instruments capable of navigating a realm where the boundary between mortal intention and the omnipotent machinery of the Omnissiah was imperceptible. Here, at the edge, life persisted not by strength or resilience alone, but by the disciplined capacity to read the whispers of steel, the tremors of machinery, and the subtle signs of divine guidance embedded in every pulse, vibration, and flicker of the extreme Manu, Factorum, in the heart of the manufactorum, where the furnaces roared and hydraulic presses pulsated like the lungs of a living organism. Tech priests moved with an authority that merged the sacred and the technical. Their every gesture was deliberate, calibrated not merely to maintain machinery, but to commune with it. They approached servo-arms cogitators and molten conduits as one might approach a sacred relic, touching, adjusting, and intoning litanies that blended precise engineering procedure with devotion to the Omnissiah. The laborers who observed them quickly learned that survival depended as much on understanding these rituals as on executing the practical mechanics of their own tasks. Iron communion demanded constant attention. A tech priest would read the vibrations of a press through calloused fingertips, feel the subtle heat differential in a conduit, and interpret the faint oscillations of a servo arm. Each reading was coupled with a litany, whispered or intoned, encoding both command and supplication. These rituals were as much about guiding the machinery as they were about shaping human perception. The repetition of words, gestures, and calibrations created a framework for understanding, a mental scaffolding that allowed mortals to survive amid the manufactorum's relentless hazards. Observation, ritual, and cognition were inseparable. One could not act without the other. Servitors themselves were participants in this communion. Their programmed motions became an extension of the tech priest's intent, their slight deviations interpreted as responses or confirmations of ritual efficacy. Micro-adjustments by machines were read as dialogue. A subtle flicker in an arc lamp, a minute pause in a hydraulic piston, or a tremor along a conduit was perceived not as mechanical error, but as communication. The tech priests trained their followers to read these signals, to anticipate actions, and to integrate them seamlessly into human motion. Every worker became both student and interlocutor in this layered exchange, reliant on disciplined perception to decode meaning embedded in steel and flame. The mental frameworks developed through iron communion were precise and unforgiving. Workers learned to anticipate machine behavior, to synchronize movements with the unspoken rhythm of servitors and hydraulic systems, and to embed ritualized gestures within every adjustment. Mistakes were costly. Failure to interpret signals could result in injury, death, or the catastrophic loss of machinery. Yet for those who mastered this integration, Life became a continuous feedback loop. Observation informed ritual, ritual informed cognition, and cognition guided action. Patterns became instinctual, microanomalies readable, and even extreme zones navigable. Shared rituals reinforced both survival and hierarchy. Tech priests coordinated sequences of incantations and calibrations across multiple machinery nodes, synchronizing laborers' actions with servitor interventions. Litanies resonated across steel halls, arc lamp flickers, marking cadence, while molten promethium channels reflected the rhythm of human and machine alike. Observation, anticipation, and response merged into a single, continuous process. Devotion was inseparable from function. Prayer guided precision, and precision reinforced belief. Each participant, human or machine, was a conduit for both mechanical stability and metaphysical alignment, a node in the ever-expanding lattice of cognition, ritual, and survival. The psychological weight of this communion was immense. Humans were constantly monitoring multiple streams of information, vibrations, temperature fluctuations, servitor motion, and arc lamp oscillations. Rituals provided structure, anchoring cognition against the overwhelming sensory input of the manufactorum. Prayer, gestures, and repeated calibration sequences became tools for interpreting chaos, transforming hazard into interpretable signal. In these conditions, survival was not a matter of brute force, but of disciplined perception, predictive cognition, and faithful execution of codified gestures. Iron communion also blurred the distinction between human and machine. Tech priests internalized mechanical rhythms, their cognition aligned with servitor patterns and hydraulic cycles. Laborers absorbed these patterns, incorporating anticipation into every motion, linking ritualized prayer with practical adjustment. Machines were no longer inert. They were active participants, shaping action and perception. Microanomalies were read as both cautionary signal and guidance. Survival required constant attunement to these subtle cues, the ability to integrate them seamlessly into ritualized patterns, and the mental flexibility to adjust instinctively without breaking the continuity of communion by the end of each cycle. Iron communion had forged a cognitive and ritualized framework that extended human perception beyond ordinary limits. Tech priests maintained control through layered ritual, observation, and interpretation, while laborers adapted to the patterns and microsignals emerging from both servitors and machinery. Cognition, ritual, and observation were inseparable, each reinforcing the other in an ongoing cycle of survival and guidance. In this crucible, humans became attuned interpreters of mechanical and divine intent, capable of navigating the manufactorum's lethal complexity with precision. Instinct and devotion, their minds and actions integrated into a single, continuous dialogue with steel, flame, and the OMNISSIAH. In the dim corridors and shadowed alcoves of the manufactorum, survival depended not only on formal ritual or technical mastery, but on the transmission of unspoken knowledge. Laborers whispered protocols beneath the din of furnaces, beneath the hiss of hydraulic systems, and beneath the ceaseless hum of servitors. These were not recorded in data slates or inscribed on maintenance manuals. They were passed through observation, subtle gesture, and hushed speech, forming a network of informal instruction that functioned alongside official hierarchies. Here, adaptive cognition emerged as a necessity. Understanding these covert instructions often meant the difference between life and death, and mastery required careful attention to both content and context. The whispered protocols were some conveyed operational shortcuts, the angle at which a conduit should be approached, the precise timing for engaging a manipulator, or the sequence of litanies required to stabilize a particularly volatile promethium channel. Others transmitted warnings of environmental hazards, a weakened floor plate, a sudden surge in hydraulic pressure, or a microfracture in a press. More abstract guidance existed as well, the preferred alignment of gestures for servitor synchronization, subtle signs indicating that a machine's apparent deviation was intentional rather than malfunction, and codes for when to defer or intervene. These instructions were never formally sanctioned, yet their effectiveness was undeniable. They allowed laborers to anticipate danger, compensate for machine unpredictability, and navigate the manufactorum with an adaptive precision unattainable through formal ritual alone. Informal hierarchies arose naturally around this transmission. Experienced laborers, those who had endured the extremes of molten channels, microanomalies, and servitor, emergent behavior, became nodes of knowledge, recognized not by rank but by demonstrated understanding. They taught through demonstration, subtle correction, and occasional whispered warning. Newcomers learned to read these signs as instinctively as they read the machinery itself. Observation became as crucial as execution. Perception of gestures, timing, and hushed speech enabled integration into this covert network. Trust was a currency as fragile as promethium-soaked air. Misinterpretation or failure to observe protocol could result in injury, reprimand, or erasure. Servitors, though ostensibly obedient automatons, were interwoven into these whispered systems. Workers recognized when a servitor's adjustment was part of emergent behavior and when it signaled a hidden directive. Micropauses, anticipatory corrections, and slight deviations from standard sequences were read as part of the unspoken code. Laborers adapted by embedding anticipation into gesture, integrating machine microsignals into ritualized response, and calibrating each action against both observed anomaly and whispered instruction. Cognition became layered. Attention tracked formal ritual, emergent machine behavior, and covert human signals simultaneously. Each task required a constant evaluation of risk, pattern, and interpretation. These covert protocols extended beyond immediate survival. They influenced ritual adaptation, altered gesture patterns, and even shaped perception of machine signals. A laborer who understood the whispered system could anticipate servitor behavior, read microanomalies before they escalated, and calibrate actions to maintain both operational efficiency and personal safety. Litanies and incantations became flexible instruments, modifiable in timing and intensity to match anticipated deviations. The mental load was immense. Survival demanded continuous integration of observation, learned protocol, instinct, and ritual. Micro-adjustments were performed with awareness of both explicit instruction and tacit guidance, producing a cognitive framework that functioned under extreme, high-pressure conditions. Mistakes within this shadowed system carried immediate consequences. A misread gesture, a delayed adjustment, or a failure to incorporate servitor nuance could cascade into mechanical failure or personal injury. The whispering network reinforced adaptive cognition by providing constant, context-sensitive feedback. Laborers refined perception through repetition and observation, internalizing not just procedures, but the reasoning and anticipation that guided them. In essence, the whispered protocols acted as both instruction and cognitive augmentation, extending human perception into the nuanced behavior of machinery and the emergent patterns of servitors. By the end of the cycle, the manufactorum operated not merely as a machine of metal and flame, but as a network of observation, ritual, and unspoken collaboration. Covert instruction had embedded adaptive cognition into laborers' thought processes, merging formal ritual, emergent machine behavior, and whispered guidance into a seamless continuum. Survival depended on decoding multiple streams of information simultaneously, interpreting them correctly, and executing with precision, all while maintaining the cadence of litanies and the discipline of ritual. Within this crucible, laborers became attuned interpreters of both overt and hidden signals, navigating the manufactorum's lethal complexity with intelligence, anticipation, and a subtle mastery that extended beyond codified instruction. into the shadowed realm of whispered knowledge. The manufactorum was a cathedral of steel, fire, and smoke, but within its endless corridors and molten arteries. The sacred was fractured into fragments, each worker carrying a piece of faith that no formal liturgy could fully contain. The litanies chanted by tech priests rang with authority, their cadence unyielding, echoing off the girders and molten channels. Yet among the lowest-ranked laborers, ritual had become a living, breathing system of adaptation. Each gesture traced soot across conduits, each manipulator adjusted with a subtle deviation, carried the weight of personal interpretation. Survival required not merely repetition, but understanding and intuitive sense of the machinery's rhythm and the slight micro-anomalies that indicated both hazard and guidance. Faith, in these moments, was both cognitive tool and shield. Hands moved across hydraulic pistons and molten promethium channels with deliberate care, each touch encoding intention, observation, and supplication simultaneously. Gestures were shaped not only by the canon of ritual, but by immediate necessity, a conduit misaligned, a servo arm trembling, a press beating unevenly. Laborers learned to calibrate their actions to these subtle variations. A misaligned gesture could prevent disaster. A whispered adjustment could redirect emergent servitor behavior. These fragments of faith were intensely personal, yet they were shaped by the collective memory of repeated cycles. They encoded knowledge of the machine's temperament, the environment's peril, and the rhythm of human survival. Observation was paramount. Laborers scanned hydraulic conduits for microscopic stress fractures, read the flicker of arc clamps for temporal anomalies, and interpreted the subtle shifts in servitor motion as intentional guidance or warning. Each micro-anomaly was layered with meaning, interpreted through the dual lens of survival and devotion. Improvisation became integral to ritual. A gesture performed to align with a press's contraction was also a prayer for protection. A recalibration of molten promethium flows served practical function and metaphysical affirmation simultaneously. In this environment, cognition and faith were inseparable. To act without interpretive understanding was to court injury or death. The social dimensions of fragmented faith added further complexity. Experienced laborers became nodes of tacit knowledge, teaching newcomers the subtleties of micro-anomalies and adaptive gestures. Deviations from formal ritual were observed and emulated when effective, and whispered protocols circulated in hidden corners of the manufactorum. Some laborers whispered variations of tech priest litanies to match machinery rhythms, aligning prayer with the subtle oscillations of hydraulic pistons or the hum of molten conduits. Others introduced pauses, extended gestures, or minor recalibrations based on their perception of servitor behavior. These practices were neither sanctioned nor uniform, yet they were indispensable, forming an invisible hierarchy of competence rooted in adaptive cognition. The psychological weight of this fractured faith was immense. Extreme zones subjected the body to relentless heat, vibration, and chemical exposure. Every action carried risk, every micro-anomaly demanded attention, and every deviation in machinery was a potential threat. Faith, even in fragmentary form, stabilized perception. Ritualized gestures anchored cognition, creating predictable mental frameworks amidst environmental chaos. Prayer modulated attention, guiding the mind to anticipate hazards and coordinate with the subtle signals emitted by machines. In effect, each laborer had internalized a cognitive scaffolding, a lattice of perception, ritual, and predictive adjustment that extended human capability into the lethal machinery of the forge. Fragmentation did not mean disorder. Each laborer developed idiosyncratic liturgies, yet these variations were bounded by operational reality. A gesture misaligned with machinery could cause catastrophe. A chant mistimed could disrupt emergent servitor behavior. Thus, faith fragments became iterative, evolving through experience. A cycle of observation, trial, and correction refined gestures, timing, and incantation. Over weeks and months, laborers integrated personal interpretation with canonical structure, producing hybridized rituals that were both adaptive and functional. Liturgy became a dynamic instrument. Prayer informed action, and action reinforced understanding of both machine and divine will. Interactions with servitors deepened this complexity. Though programmed for obedience, servitors exhibited emergent behavior in extreme zones. They paused, corrected, or anticipated human adjustments. Laborers interpreted these deviations through the lens of fragmentary faith. A tremor in a manipulator was guidance. A misalignment in an arc lamp's flicker was a sign from the omniscient. Humans adjusted gestures, recalibrated hydraulic timing, or extended litanies to harmonize with these signals. Cognition was layered and continuous, integrating observation, memory, ritual, and anticipatory response. Machines, in turn, became participants in the sacred calculus. Their emergent adjustments reinforced human interpretations, creating a feedback loop of adaptive behavior and devotional action. Environmental factors magnified the stakes. Prometheum channels glowed with shifting intensity. Hydraulic presses shook steel floors with unpredictable frequency, and arc lamps flickered with uneven luminosity. Heat pressed against skin, and chemical fumes saturated the air, dulling sensation but heightening cognitive effort. Every action demanded integrated perception, adjusting a conduit while monitoring vibration, anticipating a servitor's motion, and maintaining rhythm in ritual. The manufactorum became a crucible not only of heat and steel, but of cognition itself. Fragmented faith acted as a guide, structuring attention and enabling anticipation in a space where miscalculation was instantly punished. Laborers also adapted ritual to social cues. Whispered corrections, microgestures, and hushed signals transmitted through groups created a lattice of tacit instruction. The interplay of personal faith and collective observation ensured that deviations from canon did not degrade operational efficiency. Instead, they optimized responsiveness to the unpredictable machinery and extreme environment. New laborers learned to interpret these signals, integrating observation of peers with their own emergent rituals. Over time, cognition, ritual, and perception merged into continuous, anticipatory behavior. Each individual became both observer and participant in a dynamic system of faith, mechanics, and survival. Fragments of faith extended into moral and existential cognition. Laborers perceived the indifferent system of the manufactorum as simultaneously threatening and guiding. Machinery offered no explicit intent, yet emergent behavior and subtle microanomalies suggested patterns that could be interpreted as divine communication. Human improvisation was framed as negotiation with an omnipotent and indifferent industrial system. Each gesture, chant, and adjustment was an assertion of agency within this framework, a claim of understanding over chaos. Faith fragments were thus both survival, heuristic, and moral compass, aligning action with both human cognition and the imagined guidance of the omniscient. Cycles of labor reinforced the persistence of these fragments. Repetition stabilized perception, honed predictive capabilities, and refined ritualized gestures. Observing the machinery and servitors for extended periods allowed laborers to anticipate deviations, interpret emergent behavior, and adjust both liturgy and movement accordingly. Microanomalies became signals, gesture modifications became communication, and chants evolved in cadence and timing to match the rhythms of steel, flame, and hydraulic contraction. Cognition operated at the intersection of observation, ritual, and anticipation, with faith fragments serving as the scaffolding that sustained focus and precision under relentless stress by the end of each rotation. The manufactorum was not merely a collection of steel, fire, and service. It had become a network of cognition, observation, ritual, and adaptive interpretation. Fragmented faith allowed humans to navigate extreme environments, integrate emergent machine behavior, and maintain operational function. Each gesture, chant, and micro-adjustment carried layered significance, ensuring both survival and alignment with perceived divine intent. Laborers had internalized a dynamic system. Cognition, ritual, and perception were inseparable, each reinforcing the other, creating a continuous dialogue with the industrial and metaphysical forces surrounding them. Through this integration, human agency persisted amid the omnipresent machinery of the omnis. Fragmented faith bridged the gap between formal orthodoxy and emergent necessity, allowing laborers to negotiate meaning, anticipate hazard, and act with precision. Observation of machines, servitors, and peers created a multi-layered cognitive system, with rituals acting as both guide and stabilizer. Each individual became an interpreter of patterns, a reader of micro-anomalies, and a participant in a continuous feedback loop of perception, ritual, and survival. The manufacturum's indifferent industrial system was no longer a purely mechanical environment. It had become a domain of layered cognition and devotional interpretation, navigable only by those attuned to the subtle interplay of faith, machine, and human observation. By integrating observation, improvisation, ritual, and micro-anomaly interpretation, laborers transformed survival into a continuous negotiation with the omnipresent industrial system. Fragmented faith was no longer simply belief. It was a cognitive tool, a ritual scaffold, and a lens through which the chaos of steel, flame, and servitors could be interpreted, managed, and leveraged. The manufacturum demanded precision, adaptation, and interpretive skill. Those who mastered these fragments of faith survived, their minds and bodies synchronized with the rhythms of machinery, the cadence of ritual, and the hidden guidance of the omnisci. In this crucible, faith became action, cognition became devotion, and survival became an ongoing act of interpretive communion with the indifferent forces of fire and steel. The manufacturum never ceased its scrutiny. Every press, every conduit, every arc lamp, flicker was an unblinking eye, recording human and servitor alike, and reflecting their motions back as both guide and threat. Observation was the currency of survival. Misstep or misperception could trigger injury, machinery failure, or immediate reprimand. Laborers internalized this unyielding gaze, their cognition calibrated to read not only mechanical signals, but the faint cues of those around them. Tech priests, moving with deliberate precision, added a further layer of surveillance, their eyes fogged, and servo enhancements, absorbing minute deviations, subtle hesitations, and unspoken intentions. Continuous monitoring exacted a relentless cognitive toll. The mind was forced into layered attention, hydraulic pulsations, thermal shifts in promethium channels, emergent deviations from servitor behavior, the cadence of litanies, and the micro-adjustments of peers all demanded simultaneous interpretation. Each input carried consequence, each omission potential catastrophe. Laborers developed an instinctual sense of timing, aligning actions with these streams, anticipating responses, and integrating corrective measures before errors could manifest. Observation was not passive. It required predictive cognition, memory, and a constant mental rehearsal of procedure, gesture, and potential anomaly. Mechanical observation was precise, almost sentient in its constancy. Servo arms monitored operator pressure, conduits registered minute thermal gradients, and hydraulic presses transmitted oscillations through the steel floor. Emergent machine behavior, though subtle, was never invisible. Micropauses, tremors, or shifts in alignment were interpreted as signs, either of mechanical wear or as anticipatory guidance embedded within the system. Laborers learned to read these signals in conjunction with ritualized gestures, creating a continuous loop of feedback. Machine informs human, human adjusts. Gesture, ritual, recalibrate, and machinery responds in turn. Cognition became a layered network, with observation at its core. Human observation compounded the complexity. Skilled laborers noted micro-adjustments by peers, anticipating corrective actions and integrating them into their own motions. Deviations from canonical ritual were often signals of emergent hazard rather than negligence. Recognizing intent behind subtle gestures or whispered instructions became as critical as reading machine behavior. Hierarchies formed around perceptual acuity. Those capable of integrating multiple layers of observation were both the most effective and the most relied upon. Novices were trained in this network of surveillance through repetition, subtle correction, and immersion, gradually internalizing the constant vigilance required to survive. The weight of observation extended beyond mere perception. It became a continuous negotiation of cognitive capacity and physical action. Attention was finite, yet demanded to be expansive, monitoring machinery, peers, ritual cadence, and environmental feedback simultaneously. Errors were rarely isolated. One misread signal could cascade into misalignment, injury, or equipment failure. Laborers relied on ritualized gestures and litanies not only for devotion, but as scaffolding to structure attention, anchoring cognition in a sea of sensory overload. Observation, ritual, and action became inseparable. Each supported the other, creating a cognitive architecture capable of withstanding the extreme demands of the manufactorum. Emergent servitor behavior introduced further uncertainty. Machines adapted, adjusted, and responded within programmed parameters, but also exhibited subtle deviations in extreme zones. Laborers were forced to anticipate these variations, interpreting micropauses or tremors as signs requiring preemptive adjustment. Observation became predictive rather than reactive, a constant negotiation of intention, expectation, and action. Servitors themselves were both instruments and observers. Their emergent behavior, a form of feedback that reinforced human vigilance. The manufactorum was a dynamic system of reciprocal monitoring, where failure to observe precisely was a threat to both life and operational continuity. Social observation added additional layers of cognitive burden. Whispered protocols, minor gesture variations, and hidden cues were embedded in laborer networks. Understanding these signals required attention, memory, and interpretation in context. Each worker had to maintain awareness of both mechanical and human cues, adjusting personal ritual, gesture timing, and machine interaction in response to signals from peers and emergent servitors alike. These networks of observation created a covert hierarchy, where knowledge and perceptual acuity defined authority and survival potential. Errors in interpreting human or machine behavior carried immediate and sometimes lethal consequences, reinforcing the imperative for constant, layered vigilance. The psychological weight of this unceasing observation was profound. Laborers were perpetually attuned to microanomalies, gesture deviations, and whispered signals, translating perception into precise action. Cognitive fatigue was mitigated through ritualized scaffolding, incantations synchronized with machine cycles, gestures timed to hydraulic pulsations, and coordinated observation with peers created a rhythm that structured attention. Yet even this architecture could falter under extreme stress. Surges of heat, sudden machinery failure, or unanticipated servitor deviations demanded rapid recalibration, pushing human cognition to its limits. Observation was not merely surveillance. It was endurance, prediction, and continuous adaptation under relentless pressure. Within these cycles, patterns of attention and adaptation emerged. Skilled laborers internalized rhythms of machinery, predicting deviations and aligning ritualized gestures accordingly. Microanomalies became signals for action. Whispers between humans became predictive cues, and the feedback loop of observation, ritual, and adjustment stabilized both cognition and survival. The manufactorum operated as a complex system, where each worker was simultaneously observed, an observer, responding dynamically to a landscape of heat, flame, vibration, and unspoken instruction. Cognitive load was immense, yet through ritual, repetition, and integration of multiple observational streams, human agency persisted. The weight of observation also shaped perception of time, priority, and significance. Every moment contained potential hazard, every motion encoded risk, and every gesture carried layered meaning. Laborers learned to prioritize attention, filtering sensory input, distinguishing emergent anomaly from background noise, and integrating ritual into predictive cognition. Observation was no longer passive recording. It was an active cognitive strategy, a continuous loop of monitoring, anticipation, and correction. Failure to maintain vigilance had immediate consequence, reinforcing the necessity of precision and layered awareness. By the end of each cycle, the manufactorum had become an ecosystem of surveillance, cognition, and adaptive ritual. Human and machine observation were intertwined. Emergent behavior was integrated into predictive action, and personal and social signals informed continuous adjustment. Survival depended on maintaining this multi-layered attention, balancing microanomaly interpretation, peer observation, and ritualized action in a relentless crucible of steel, flame, and promethium. The weight of observation was both burden and instrument, shaping cognition, guiding action, and sustaining life within the indifferent machinery of the Omnissiah. Cognition, ritual, and perception were inseparable under this weight. Micro-adjustments, predictive interpretation, and adaptive gestures created a continuous feedback system, where human action both responded to and influenced the environment. Every laborer became an interpreter of layered signals, capable of synchronizing with machinery, servitors, peers, and the rhythm of ritual. Observation demanded endurance, precision, and anticipatory reasoning, yet it also structured cognition, enabling survival in extreme conditions where error was intolerable. The manufactorum exacted its cost, yet it also forged a higher order of perception. Humans attuned to microanomalies, emergent machine behavior, and subtle human cues could navigate extreme zones, anticipate hazard, and maintain operational continuity. Observation became both strategy and discipline, the ability to integrate multiple streams of data, adjust ritual and gesture dynamically, and act with precision defined both authority and survival. In this environment, the weight of observation was absolute, embedding cognition within ritual, machinery, and social interaction to create a resilient, anticipatory human-machine network. By the conclusion of each rotation, the cycle of vigilance reinforced itself. Layered attention, continuous feedback, and predictive interpretation had become instinctual. Laborers internalized rhythm, gesture, microanomaly, and human signal into a coherent framework capable of sustaining operation and survival under relentless pressure. Observation, no longer merely perceptual, became an instrument of cognition, integrating ritual, machinery, and social hierarchy into a continuous system of adaptive intelligence. The manufactorum was indifferent, lethal, and unyielding, yet those who mastered its demands transformed the burden of surveillance into the scaffolding of survival. The weight of observation was not a burden alone. It was the framework through which human agency persisted. Cognition, ritual, and predictive interpretation allowed laborers to act with foresight, navigate hazard, and integrate emergent signals into coherent action. Machines, servitors, peers, and environment became participants in a continuous dialogue, and survival required mastery of this multi-layered observation. In this crucible, observation was life, cognition was ritual, and survival was the continuous act of perceiving, interpreting, and responding to the ceaseless demands of the Omnissiah. Manu, Factorum. The manufactorum's corridors were haunted not by ghosts, but by memory. Every scorched wall, every dented conduit, Every smoldering press bore traces of those who had labored, suffered, and vanished within the crucible of steel and promethium. Memory persisted in physical form, the slight distortion of a pipe where a hand had faltered, the worn grooves along a tread where boots had trailed countless cycles, the soot patterns left by repetitive gestures, now unobserved. Laborers absorbed these traces, integrating them into anticipation, gesture, and ritual. Each imprint became both warning and guide, shaping action in a world where omission could prove fatal. These residual imprints extended beyond machinery. Whispered instructions, subtle pauses in ritual, and micro-adjustments left by absent workers became part of the cognitive fabric of the manufactorum. Observant laborers internalized them, replicating gestures, anticipating shifts in hydraulic rhythm, and interpreting emergent servitor behavior through the lens of absence. Memory functioned as both cognitive tool and moral framework. The actions of the departed informed survival strategy, guided timing, and calibrated ritual. In this environment, absence was perceptible as consequence. The vanished continued to shape motion, observation, and expectation. Psychological imprint weighed heavily. The continuous presence of absence imposed vigilance and structured cognition. Laborers navigated corridors with constant awareness of potential hazard and historical failure. A misaligned press, a flickering arc lamp, or an unobserved conduit became a locus for layered perception, combining environmental signal with recollection. Memory intertwined with ritual. Gestures performed in anticipation of hazard bore subtle echoes of those who had once executed them. Prayers for protection carried an unspoken acknowledgement of prior suffering, and micro-adjustments incorporated the lessons embedded in absence. Cognition was continuously reinforced by these traces, forming a living map of risk, error, and survival strategy. Emergent servitor behavior interacted with memory. Machines were programmed for precision, yet their micro-adjustments, pauses, and anticipatory shifts were read by laborers through accumulated experience. Historical traces guided interpretation. Previous failures and minor accidents were encoded into gesture timing, hydraulic adjustments, and predictive alignment with machinery. Memory became both sensorium and scaffold, informing the anticipatory cognition required to navigate high-risk zones. Laborers learned to merge present observation with the residual imprint of past cycles, translating historical evidence into actionable guidance. Social dynamics were equally informed by memory. The behavior of peers was constantly read in the context of accumulated experience and prior absence. Subtle signals, deviations in posture, whispered variations in ritual, and micro-adjustments were interpreted against the backdrop of remembered performance. Hierarchies of perception emerged, favoring those who could integrate memory traces into precise action. Novices were trained in this system, instructed not only in canonical ritual, but in the history embedded in the corridors, the presses, and the conduits. Memory became both teacher and measure, establishing patterns of expectation, authority, and adaptive strategy. Rituals were the principal repository of memory. Gestures, litanies, and incantations preserved both operational instruction and historical observation. A pause in a chant could replicate the timing of a foregone error. An adjustment in hydraulic alignment could anticipate micro-anomalies encountered by predecessors. Fragmented faith and ritualized repetition thus served dual function: devotion to the omnissiah and encoding of accumulated operational knowledge. Memory persisted as structure, guiding cognition in real time while preserving traces of those who could no longer act themselves. Environmental stress intensified the imprint of memory. Heat, vibration, promethium fumes, and the physical weight of machinery reinforced the significance of historical traces. Laborers' perception was sharpened by necessity. A shadowed corridor, a scorched panel, or an unsteady servitor triggered recollection, anticipation, and corrective action. Memory became integrated into predictive cognition, anticipating machine failure, adjusting gesture, and calibrating ritual. Absence was a guide. The presence of those who had succumbed to hazard or disappeared informed each decision, creating a cognitive lattice in which survival was continuously negotiated against the landscape of prior experience. Fragmented faith interacted with memory to structure perception. Gestures performed in alignment with ritual echoes reinforced cognitive stability, linking personal interpretation with operational necessity and historical precedent. Each repetition anchored attention, calibrated predictive response, and mediated emotional strain. Memory, ritual, and observation combined to produce a continuous, adaptive cognitive architecture. Human perception, informed by the traces of the past, guided action, optimized survival, and maintained alignment with machinery and micro-anomalies of the manufactorum. Emergent patterns of behavior became encoded in corridors and machinery. Laborers unconsciously replicated gestures, timing, and micro-adjustments observed in traces of past cycles. These patterns reinforced predictability, facilitated cooperative action, and mitigated risk. Absence transformed into a guide. Memory and imprint provided operational continuity, preserving knowledge beyond individual tenure or life. Laborers became interpreters of both visible machinery and historical traces, bridging presence and absence, past and immediate action, in a continuous cycle of adaptation and survival. By the end of each cycle, the manufactorum was a palimpsest of human action, mechanical precision, and ritualized observation. Memory persisted in each worn conduit, scorched surface, and adjusted hydraulic press. Laborers carried these traces into their gestures, anticipations, and prayers, integrating history into cognition. Absence was never empty. It was a repository of guidance, warning, and structured expectation. Survival depended on reading these layers accurately, translating residual imprint into actionable insight, and aligning present behavior with lessons embedded in the environment and ritual. Cognition, ritual, and memory were inseparable under these conditions. Each laborer became simultaneously actor, observer, and archivist, interpreting microanomalies, anticipatory behavior, and historical traces to maintain operational continuity. Absence was continuously present, shaping motion, expectation, and ritualized attention. Memory provided both warning and instruction, anchoring action in accumulated experience while supporting predictive cognition under extreme environmental stress. The manufactorum, indifferent and relentless, was rendered navigable only through integration of present observation, emergent signals, and the psychological imprint of those who had come before. Memory also reinforced social and hierarchical structures. Skilled laborers interpreted historical traces with precision, guiding peers and shaping collective behavior. Novices observed and internalized these patterns, learning not only canonical ritual, but the practical adaptations embedded in absence. Tacit knowledge transmitted through observation of memory imprints created a network of cognitive scaffolding, facilitating survival, optimizing predictive behavior, and maintaining operational efficiency under relentless pressure. History was active, shaping the present in every gesture, chant, and micro-dash adjustment. The manufactorum's extreme zones demanded constant vigilance and adaptation. Memory traces informed both anticipation and reaction. A misaligned press remembered from prior cycles, a scorched conduit signaling hazard, a whisper of a gesture repeated from absent hands. Cognitive architecture integrated these signals into real-time action, stabilizing attention and guiding gesture in higher-risk environments. Ritualized repetition, informed by memory, anchored both perception and physical execution, mediating the relentless cognitive load imposed by extreme conditions. By synthesizing observation, memory, ritual, and adaptive interpretation, laborers transformed the manufactorum into a domain navigable by cognition. Absent workers continued to shape action, their imprints embedded in gesture, ritual, and micro-adjustment. Survival required decoding these traces, integrating them into real-time operation, and aligning both ritual and predictive response with emergent machinery and servitor behavior. Memory was a living instrument, preserving experience beyond individual life and embedding operational knowledge into the continuous rhythm of the forge. Through this integration, presence and absence coalesced into a single operational reality. Laborers internalized traces of those who had vanished, interpreting micro-anomalies, environmental stress, and emergent servitor behavior through accumulated memory. Ritual, observation, and cognition were inseparable, forming a continuous feedback system in which absence informed survival, faith informed action, and predictive interpretation mediated hazard. The manufactorum was not merely a crucible of steel and flame. It was a layered cognitive system, navigable only by those capable of reading memory, integrating ritual, and sustaining attention under relentless environmental and operational stress. The imprint of absent hands extended even into moral cognition. Laborers were attuned not only to mechanical hazard, but to the consequences of omission, misalignment, or error historically recorded in the environment. Memory reinforced both operational and ethical orientation. Gestures, ritual, and observation were calibrated against historical precedent, ensuring attention to both survival and perceived propriety. Absence guided action, informing choice, timing, and alignment with both machinery and canonical expectation. In this way, memory became a moral as well as cognitive scaffold, shaping behavior, perception, and ritual in the crucible of extreme labor. By the end of cycles, cognition, ritual, and memory formed a continuous triad. Micro-adjustments, anticipatory gestures, and emergent observation integrated traces of the past into present action, stabilizing attention, supporting predictive behavior, and maintaining alignment with machinery, servitors, and ritualized expectation. The manufactorum, indifferent and relentless, was navigable only by those who could internalize memory, interpret traces, and align cognition with action. Survival, in the crucible of molten steel, required mastery of absence, presence, and the psychological weight of those who had come before. The manufactorum demanded obedience, precision, and repetition, yet survival hinged on subtle deviations, micro-strategies, and the silent calculus of adaptation. Each laborer was bound by rigid protocols, incantations, and ritualized gestures. Yet every shift in heat, vibration, or hydraulic pressure required instantaneous improvisation. Adaptation became invisible, encoded in gestures too small to register on the servitor's sensors. In pauses between litanies, in slight variations of movement along conveyor belts and molten channels, these silent adjustments were cognitive acts, bridging the formal structure of canonical procedure and the practical realities of hazard, fatigue, and emergent anomaly. Observation remained the primary tool. Microanomalies in machinery, subtle tremors of servoarms, and fluctuations in promethium flow demanded rapid recalibration. Laborers translated these signals into anticipatory gestures, a finger shift on a calibration wheel, a microstep to avoid splatter, a fraction of a second delay in gesture to accommodate servitor response. Each adjustment was both defensive and procedural, integrating personal experience, historical traces, and predictive cognition. Improvisation was not reckless, but precisely informed, a hidden layer of cognition that ensured continuity within rigid operational parameters. Social coordination underpinned these silent strategies. Laborers read one another's anticipatory movements, micropauses, and whispered cues to orchestrate collective adaptation. Hierarchical awareness emerged, not only through rank, but through perceptual acuity and rapid improvisation. Those able to integrate environmental observation, historical memory, and peer behavior into real-time strategy assumed implicit leadership, guiding novices and coordinating emergent adjustments without explicit instruction. Social cognition became a survival mechanism, a shared anticipatory network invisible to higher-ranking tech priests, but critical for operational continuity. Rituals served both obedience and adaptation. Gestures and chants provided scaffolding, a temporal and procedural anchor against the unpredictability of extreme zones. Micro-variations in ritual timing, subtle modulation of intonation, or the insertion of unprescribed gestures allowed laborers to negotiate hazard while preserving canonical observance. Each deviation was small enough to escape detection, yet significant enough to preserve alignment with both machinery and environmental feedback. Improvisation was embedded in ritual, invisible, silent, yet essential. Cognitive load was immense. Every adjustment required simultaneous monitoring of multiple streams, machinery rhythm, hydraulic oscillations, thermal gradients, servitor behavior, pure microgestures, and ritual cadence. Predictive reasoning was continuous, integrating sensory input, historical traces, and emergent anomalies into instantaneous corrective action. Each microstrategy was a node in a dynamic network of attention, balancing strict protocol against adaptive necessity. Failure to adjust silently could cascade into injury, equipment failure, or ritual disruption. Survival demanded precision, foresight, and continuous negotiation between rigidity and flexibility. Emergent servitor behavior added complexity, even within programmed parameters. Micro-pauses, slight misalignments, and adaptive calibration required human interpretation and correction. Laborers incorporated these signals into their silent adjustments, predicting deviations and subtly compensating in gesture, timing, and ritual. The boundary between machine and human cognition blurred. Anticipatory human adjustments guided servitor response, while servitor anomalies informed predictive action, creating a continuous feedback loop of mutual observation, interpretation, and adaptation. Environmental hazard intensified the need for molten channels, shifting promethium levels, and fluctuating thermal stress demanded immediate recalibration. Laborers employed spatial awareness, timing, and subtle tactile feedback to navigate risk. Even minor misalignment could produce catastrophic failure. Every movement, every pause, and every micro-adjustment carried weight. Improvisation, integrated into ritual and observation, transformed risk into manageable variance, allowing laborers to survive within an otherwise lethal environment. Memory reinforced adaptation. Historical traces of prior failure-scorched conduit, misaligned hydraulic press, or an absent peer's vanished workstation provided anticipatory signals. Laborers interpreted these imprints, adjusting microgestures, ritual timing, and observation accordingly. Memory became both guide and instrument, shaping improvisation without disrupting canonical practice. Absence informed action, embedding survival knowledge into every movement, every calibration, and every whispered incantation. Social observation further refined microstrategy. Novices and skilled laborers alike monitored each other, internalizing small deviations and integrating them into predictive response. Subtle shifts in posture, hand position, or ritual cadence became signals of hazard, guiding collaborative adjustment. These silent networks of coordination allowed collective improvisation without overt instruction, embedding adaptive intelligence into the fabric of the manufactorum. Faith intersected with adjustment. Ritualized gestures and litanies anchored cognition, providing a temporal structure that allowed laborers to absorb micro-variations without losing alignment to canonical observance. Deviations were framed as minor interpretations, reconciled through prayer or internal liturgical reasoning. Cognitive architecture was stabilized. Observation, memory, ritual, and micro-strategy interwove, permitting anticipatory improvisation within the constraints of obedience. Survival was cognitive, ritual, and physical simultaneously. Over cycles, these adaptations became instinctual. Laborers internalized a rhythm of observation, micro-adjustment, and anticipatory action. Each gesture carried historical, mechanical, and social knowledge, enabling rapid response to emergent anomaly. Improvisation was invisible yet pervasive. It structured attention, mediated hazard, and reinforced predictive cognition. Canonical procedure remained intact. Adaptation occurred silently within its constraints. The manufactorum, relentless in hazard and indifference, demanded this integration for survival. Microstrategies extended to social negotiation. Laborers observed peer errors, subtle misalignments, and whispered cues, adjusting their own behavior to compensate. Hierarchies formed around perceptual acuity and adaptive skill, rather than formal rank alone. Knowledge was transmitted silently through gesture, observation, and shared adjustment, reinforcing collective survival. Improvisation was communal, yet covert, preserving operational continuity while remaining invisible to formal authority. Extreme zones demanded refinement. Heat flux, mechanical instability, and servitor deviations required continuous recalibration. Laborers synchronized micro-adjustments with hydraulic cycles, thermal pulses, and ritual cadence. Each action was both survival and ritual, balancing risk against canonical observance. Improvisation became embedded in the rhythm of labor, transforming hazard into manageable variance. Human cognition, structured by ritual and memory, mediated machine behavior, environmental hazard, and social coordination simultaneously. The integration of observation, memory, ritual, and improvisation produced a resilient cognitive system. Silent adjustments encoded survival knowledge, predictive response, and operational efficiency into everyday labor. Microstrategies were simultaneously defensive, procedural, and anticipatory, embedded in gesture, chant, and observation. Laborers acted as both interpreters and guides, responding to emergent behavior, historical traces, and environmental stress. Adaptation became continuous, invisible, and indispensable. By the end of each operational cycle, the manufactorum was a network of imperceptible negotiation. Humans adjusted silently, machines responded predictively, ritual anchored cognition, and memory informed action. Microstrategies sustained life, preserved operational continuity, and encoded survival knowledge for future cycles. Improvisation, embedded in canonical observance and silent adaptation, reconciled rigid protocol with dynamic necessity. The manufactorum demanded it. Survival was contingent upon it. Each gesture, pause, and incantation carried dual function, obedience and adaptation. Laborers internalized the imperatives of canonical procedure while simultaneously adjusting to emergent hazard, servitor variation, and environmental stress. Silent strategies were anticipatory, predictive, and reactive, allowing cognition to navigate extreme conditions without explicit instruction. Improvisation was the unseen scaffolding of survival, embedded in observation, ritual, memory, and micro-adjustment. Through these cycles, cognition evolved under the weight of continuous observation and hazard. Laborers became simultaneously observer, interpreter, and actor, internalizing micro-strategies into instinctual response. Ritual and canonical observance persisted, but adaptation was silent, anticipatory, and integrated. The manufactorum, lethal and indifferent, was navigable only through mastery of observation, micro-adjustment, and predictive improvisation. Silent strategies were the axis of survival, the invisible calculus underpinning every gesture, chant, and micromotion within the crucible of steel and promethium. The manufactorum demanded obedience, yet within the endless cycles of labor, subtle acts of defiance emerged. These were not overt rebellions, which would invite swift annihilation, but micro-gestures, imperceptible calibrations, and whispered deviations in ritual. Laborers tested the boundaries of procedure, adjusting hydraulic levers a fraction differently, prolonging the pause between litanies, or shifting servitor alignment just enough to observe response. These were experiments in presence, assertions of autonomy within a system designed to eradicate individuality. Every act of deviation was measured, deliberate, and calibrated against the constant threat of detection. Servitors, though ostensibly obedient, exhibited emergent behavior alongside human defiance. Minor hesitations, repeated gestures, or micro-adjustments beyond programming created a parallel pattern of subtle autonomy. Laborers observed these flickers closely, interpreting them as signals or opportunities. The boundary between human and machine began to blur. An anticipatory pause in a servitor's movement could be matched by a micro-adjustment in human gesture, each acting as mirror and counterpoint. These small deviations became a shared language of subtle assertion, a covert negotiation between flesh and metal within the crucible of the forge. Cognition under defiance required acute awareness. Every minor adjustment carried risk. A slight misalignment of machinery, an overlooked calibration, or a forgotten incantation could cascade into catastrophe. Laborers internalized a dual mindset, maintaining canonical observance while simultaneously evaluating potential for minor deviation. Memory, ritual, and predictive observation integrated into a single cognitive framework. Each flicker of defiance was an experiment grounded in historical knowledge, environmental awareness, and emergent machine behavior. Survival depended on precision in both compliance and deviation. The psychological impact was profound. These acts, though small, provided affirmation of presence, agency, and skill. In a system designed to erase individuality, a successful micro-defiance reinforced cognition, focus, and self-perception. Laborers became practitioners of invisible resistance, balancing threat and necessity. Each successful calibration against rigid protocol produced heightened awareness, sharpened observation, and refined anticipatory skill. Autonomy, though fleeting, carried disproportionate psychological weight, sustaining cognitive resilience in the face of unrelenting environmental and operational pressure. Ritual adapted to incorporate defiance. Minor deviations were framed as interpretive acts within liturgical repetition. An extended pause could be justified as contemplation. A slight adjustment in hydraulic pressure as alignment correction. A whispered variation in chant as intensified devotion. These interpretations preserved canonical appearance while accommodating subtle autonomy. Gesture, incantation, and calibration converged in a disciplined improvisation that remained invisible to higher-ranking tech priests and custodes. Defiance was not chaos, it was structured, deliberate, and cognitively integrated into survival strategy. Social observation reinforced these acts. Laborers observed peer micro-adjustments and deviations, internalizing successful tactics and avoiding errors that could invite sanction. A network of silent awareness developed, where subtle signals, postural shifts, or whispered micro-corrections conveyed unspoken knowledge. Emergent coordination allowed collective minor defiance without overt transgression. These shared strategies created a covert community of cognition, where survival, observation, and skill converged in acts imperceptible to formal authority yet critical to continuity and resilience. Environmental hazard magnified both risk and significance of defiance. Molten channels, promethium flows, and shifting thermal stress meant that even minor deviation could escalate into catastrophe. Laborers calibrated each action with precision, blending canonical observance, historical memory, and environmental observation. Defiance was tested against hazard, A momentary shift in gesture could allow survival in one cycle, but be fatal in the next. Each act required acute perception, adaptive cognition, and predictive reasoning. The manufactorum's lethality imposed discipline on every flicker of autonomy, enforcing rigor even in acts of subtle rebellion. Memory functioned as both guide and limitation. Traces of prior errors, vanished workers, and emergent servitor misalignment informed decisions, ensuring that defiance remained within survivable boundaries. Historical patterns encoded into corridor surfaces, hydraulic panels, and scorched conduit provided anticipatory knowledge. Laborers internalized these signals, balancing risk and reward. Defiance was not impulsive. It was informed, measured, and integrated into an ongoing negotiation between canonical procedure, environmental hazard, and emergent anomaly. Emergent servitor behavior intersected with human defiance. Slight deviations in programmed motion, micro-hesitations, or repeated gestures were observed, mirrored, or countered by laborers. This produced a feedback loop of subtle autonomy. Human deviation elicited machine variation, which informed the next micro-adjustment. The boundary between obedience and autonomy became fluid, a shared domain of anticipation, reaction, and adaptation. Observation, gesture, and micro-adjustment coalesced into a continuous, imperceptible dialogue within the forge. Faith intersected with defiance, providing cognitive and emotional scaffolding. Ritualized gestures, litanies, and canonical procedures framed deviation as interpretive or intensified devotion. Cognitive dissonance was mitigated. The structure of obedience absorbed a rebellion. Ritualized repetition anchored cognition, and memory ensured safety margins. Defiance became a controlled experiment within the crucible of faith, machinery, and hazard, sustaining both survival and cognitive presence under extreme environmental and operational pressure. Over time, these acts of defiance shaped cognition and operational awareness. Laborers internalized anticipatory frameworks, blending observation, ritual, memory, and subtle deviation into an integrated cognitive system. Micro-adjustments became instinctual, predictive reasoning sharpened, and attention stabilized. Each successful flicker reinforced skill, presence, and adaptive intelligence. The manufactorum remained indifferent. Yet these small acts allowed human presence to assert itself within a system designed to suppress individuality. Social hierarchies evolved around perceptual acuity and successful Skilled laborers guided peers through implicit demonstration, modeling effective, imperceptible deviation. Novices learned through observation, internalizing subtle cues, gesture timing, and anticipatory strategies. Knowledge was transmitted without instruction, embedded in performance, memory, and ritual. The result was a covert network of autonomy, an invisible scaffolding of cognition, survival, and presence that persisted across cycles and personnel changes. Extreme zones amplified both necessity and opportunity for defiance. Shifting promethium flows, thermal fluctuations, and servitor microanomalies demanded continuous adjustment. Laborers balanced canonical observance with micro-innovation, integrating observation, memory, ritual, and predictive reasoning. Each flicker of defiance was calibrated to maximize survival, test emergent machine behavior, and assert presence without triggering sanction. Improvisation was disciplined, structured, and cognitively rigorous. The manufactorum became a layered system of obedience and autonomy. Human cognition, informed by memory, ritual, and observation, engaged with servitor behavior, environmental hazard, and canonical expectation in continuous negotiation. Micro-strategies of defiance were embedded in gesture, chant, and calibration, invisible yet consequential. Presence was asserted not through confrontation, but through careful, deliberate assertion within permissible margins, reinforcing skill, attention, and predictive capability. by the end of operational cycles. The interplay of obedience and defiance produced a resilient cognitive architecture. Laborers acted simultaneously as observers, interpreters, and experimenters. Memory, ritual, and emergent observation informed anticipatory action. Micro-adjustments and subtle deviations asserted human presence within the mechanized, indifferent environment. Defiance was flickering, imperceptibly and structured, preserving operational continuity while sustaining cognition, skill, and agency. Even minor acts carried disproportionate weight. A single adjustment could avert accident, improve alignment, or stabilize servitor response. Each successful flicker reinforced attention, memory integration, and social awareness. Autonomy, though constrained, sustained cognitive resilience, supporting survival in the crucible of molten steel, promethium, and relentless labor. The manufactorum's harshness demanded this delicate negotiation. Obedience, ritual, and micro-defiance intertwined to preserve life, cognition, and presence against an indifferent system. By merging memory, observation, ritual, and imperceptible defiance, laborers maintained a fragile but persistent assertion of self. Each cycle embedded lessons into gesture, timing, and anticipation, creating continuity beyond individual life. Microstrategies were simultaneously defensive, predictive, and interpretive, sustaining survival and asserting presence. The flicker of defiance was the invisible heartbeat of autonomy within the manufactorum. Imperceptible, yet enduring, ephemeral, yet decisive, a cognitive thread weaving human agency into the endless machinery of steel, flame, and promethium. The manufactorum existed as a nexus of heat, vibration, and mechanized rhythm, yet its most subtle force was the resonance it imparted upon its inhabitants. Each laborer moved within a living lattice of sensory cues: the timbre of hydraulic pumps, the oscillation of servo arms, the faint hiss of promethium channels, and the faint echoes of distant litanies. These signals layered into a persistent, collective awareness, shaping cognition, gesture, and anticipatory behavior. Sensory perception became shared, not in speech, but in rhythm, vibration, and echo, creating an unspoken network of operational intuition. Laborers internalized resonance, the precise tonal shifts of machinery, the subtlest variations in thermal emission, and the microfluctuations of molten flow were not just environmental data. They became instruments for prediction, coordination, and subtle adjustment. Human perception, sharpened through repeated exposure, began to synchronize with mechanical rhythms, creating anticipatory harmony between flesh and machine. Observation extended beyond the visual. Auditory, tactile, and proprioceptive input coalesced into a comprehensive awareness that guided gesture, ritual, and improvisation. Ritual amplified resonance, repeated gestures, litanies, and calibration procedures acted as cognitive tuning, aligning human awareness with the mechanized environment. Deviations, whether voluntary or emergent, became perceptible shifts within this network, signaling hazard, opportunity, or anomaly. The resonance of flame, steel, and promethium informed action even before conscious interpretation occurred, embedding predictive cognition into gesture, posture, and micro-adjustment. Laborers acted not only in response to machine signals, but as participants in a continuous oscillation of sensory, ritual, and operational feedback. Memory reinforced collective perception. Historical trace a scorched conduit, misaligned panels, or vanished colleagues imprinted expectations and cautionary patterns into laborer cognition. Observation of these remnants, when combined with sensory resonance, guided anticipatory action. The manufactorum's environment encoded both threat and procedural knowledge, creating a distributed intelligence where memory and perception merged. Collective awareness was emergent. It arose from individual cognition, environmental cues, and the silent network of observation, improvisation, and ritualized calibration. Emergent patterns were perceptible only to those attuned. Minor synchronizations of gesture across laborers, micropauses, inlet tunis, or slight adjustments in servo-arm alignment created harmonic signals within the operational lattice. These were interpreted subconsciously, allowing collective adaptation without explicit communication. Coordination emerged through resonance. Laborers and servitors, attuned to thermal flux, vibration, and tonal variation, enabling anticipatory adjustment and continuity of workflow in extreme zones. The psychological effect of resonance was profound. Perception of shared patterns reinforced cognitive stability, mitigated fatigue, and amplified situational awareness. Laborers experienced a continuous, implicit understanding of the manufactorum, integrating hazard detection, machine behavior, and ritualized expectation. The resonance of flame, both literal and symbolic, became a medium for cognition, a channel for anticipation, and a vector for survival. Each laborer was both observer and instrument, shaping and being shaped by the oscillations of environment and ritual. Micro-strategies persisted within this network. Gesture, chant, and calibration became predictive, responding to emergent signals before conscious reasoning could articulate them. Deviations in machinery or servitor behavior generated subtle harmonic shifts, prompting adjustments in posture, timing, or ritual gesture. Memory, observation, and anticipatory cognition converged, forming a continuous feedback loop. The manufacturum's resonance encoded operational intelligence into the laborers themselves, integrating hazard, skill, and ritual into an unbroken chain of perceptual awareness. Social observation enhanced resonance. Laborers interpreted each other's micro-adjustments, slight deviations in litanies, and gesture timing as signals embedded within the environment. Knowledge transfer occurred imperceptibly, through alignment with mechanical rhythm and collective perception rather than formal instruction. The manufactorum became a lattice of synchronized awareness, human and machine, observation and action. Memory and improvisation fused into a coherent network that transcended individual cognition. Emergent, servitor behavior intersected with collective perception. Micropauses, repeated gestures, and slight deviations in programming created additional harmonic layers. Laborers learned to interpret these as predictive signals, integrating servitor variability into anticipatory action. The feedback loop between human perception, ritual, and servitor response intensified collective awareness, reinforcing coordination, operational continuity, and adaptive cognition. Even minimal variance became meaningful, encoded in subtle shifts detectable only through attuned observation. Extreme environmental conditions amplified resonance. Heat, molten promethium, and shifting hydraulics created dynamic, multi-sensory input. Laborers synchronized gestures, calibrations, and litanies to maintain operational stability. Deviations in temperature, vibration, or flow produced perceptible shifts in rhythm, which were interpreted, internalized, and responded to instantaneously. Survival depended upon tuning cognition to the resonance of the manufactorum, enabling predictive action, adaptive calibration, and anticipatory micro-strategy. Faith and ritual-mediated perception. Gestures, incantations, and canonical procedure provided temporal structure, anchoring attention and stabilizing cognition within the sensory network. Deviations could be framed as interpretive acts, mitigating cognitive dissonance while maintaining operational alignment. Resonance was both perceptual and spiritual. Flame and machine became vectors for awareness. Ritual became an instrument for predictive cognition, and laborers internalized a multi-layered network of observation, memory, and anticipatory adjustment. Over cycles, collective awareness became instinctual. Laborers internalized the rhythm of machinery, the vibration of hydraulic flow, and the tonal shifts of promethium as continuous cognitive input, gesture, ritual, and micro-adjustment synchronized with these patterns, creating an emergent intelligence distributed across individuals and machinery. Observation, memory, and improvisation became integrated into the sensory lattice, enabling rapid adaptation, hazard mitigation, and continuity of labor. Social hierarchies were reinforced through perceptual acuity and mastery of resonance. Skilled laborers guided peers implicitly, modeling timing, gesture, and anticipatory alignment. Novices learned through attunement, internalizing harmonic signals within both environment and ritual. Knowledge transfer occurred without speech, mediated entirely through observation, synchronization, and subtle adjustment. The manufactorum operated as a distributed cognitive system, where perception, memory, ritual, and microstrategy converged into a coherent, adaptive network. Emergent autonomy of servitors and humans intensified resonance. Slight deviations, micro-pauses, or variations in calibration became components of the perceptual lattice, feeding predictive cognition and anticipatory adjustment. Laborers learned to interpret harmonic shifts as operational signals, enabling synchronized response to hazard and environmental change. Collective awareness was dynamic, continuously recalibrating in response to sensory input, memory, ritual, and emergent micro-strategies. By the end of operational cycles, the resonance of flame defined cognition. Laborers navigated hazard, machinery, and servitor behavior through a continuous, distributed awareness embedded in gesture, ritual, and memory. Sensory input, canonical observance, and emergent adjustment coalesced into an anticipatory network, sustaining both survival and operational continuity. The manufactorum's flame was not merely material, it was cognitive, social, and spiritual, encoding adaptation, perception, and microstrategy into the laborers themselves. Memory, observation, ritual, and microstrategy integrated within the resonance, producing continuous, anticipatory cognition. Deviations, emergent signals, and harmonic shifts were interpreted, integrated, and acted upon seamlessly. Collective awareness was both invisible and essential. The lattice of perception bound laborers together. Human and machine, ritual and hazard, presence and survival, flame, vibration, and observation became vectors of intelligence, embedding adaptive cognition into every gesture, incantation, and micro-adjustment. Each operational cycle reinforced the lattice. Laborers internalized perceptual patterns, anticipatory responses, and microstrategies as instinctual action. Ritual anchored cognition, memory encoded hazard, and sensory resonance guided adjustment. Emergent behavior, both human and mechanical, provided continuous calibration, sustaining operational continuity. Awareness was distributed yet coherent, adaptive yet disciplined, imperceptible yet decisive. Survival and cognition were inseparable, encoded in the resonance of flame, steel, and promethium. The manufactorum's environment, lethal and indifferent, was navigable only through attunement to resonance. Laborers synchronized gesture, observation, ritual, and memory to anticipate hazard, coordinate with peers, and interpret emergent signals. Flame, machinery, and servitor behavior became instruments of perception and cognition, forming a lattice that preserved life, skill, and collective awareness. The resonance of flame was both medium and message, encoding survival intelligence into the very rhythm of labor. Obedience within the manufactorum was absolute in theory, yet in practice, survival demanded constant negotiation between rigid protocol and emergent initiative. Every laborer operated under the weight of codified expectation, hydraulic levers, servo arms, promethium channels, and ritualized litanies imposed a framework designed to suppress error and ensure continuity. Yet, beneath the veneer of compliance, micro-adjustments, anticipatory strategies, and interpretive gestures proliferated. Life depended on these subtle deviations, as blind obedience alone could not reconcile the lethal variability of molten steel, thermal flux, and servitor unpredictability. The cognitive landscape of obedience was a tension-laden field. Laborers encoded canonical procedure into memory, integrating it with environmental observation and sensory resonance. Each action required evaluation. Does strict adherence preserve continuity, or does slight deviation avert imminent hazard? The margin between compliance and autonomy was razor-thin. Micro-adjustments were not random. They were experiments in prediction, informed by memory, perception, and emergent behavior. Life existed at the threshold of obedience, where initiative and survival intertwined. Servitors, too, inhabited this edge, programmed for absolute compliance. They occasionally exhibited micro-anomalies, hesitation in motion, repeated gestures, minor misalignment that laborers learned to interpret. These deviations were not fully autonomous, but formed patterns that could be predicted, leveraged, or mirrored. The laborer's cognition integrated these signals into anticipatory frameworks. A micro-pause in servitor action could prompt subtle adjustment in human movement, synchronizing workflow and mitigating hazard. The boundary between obedience and initiative was a shared space of human and machine co-adaptation. Hazard amplified the cognitive demands of this edge. Thermal surges, molten channels, and shifting promethium flows created conditions where canonical procedure could prove fatal. Laborers developed anticipatory cognition, blending observation, memory, ritual, and adaptive adjustment into continuous operational awareness. Compliance alone was insufficient. Action required foresight, precision, and an internalized understanding of both machine behavior and environmental flux. Initiative was disciplined, structured, and inseparable from survival. Emergent micro-strategies were embedded within ritual. Litanies, gestures, and incantations framed deviations as interpretive acts, preserving canonical appearance while facilitating anticipatory action. Deviations in timing, calibration, or chant were subtle, socially intelligible, and cognitively integrated into survival strategy. Memory reinforced safety margins, while observation of peer adjustments informed adaptive behavior. Obedience was not abandoned, but augmented through interpretive cognition. Maintaining life without violating canonical expectation. Social hierarchies reflected mastery of the edge. Skilled laborers guided peers implicitly, modeling the integration of obedience and initiative. Novices learned by attunement, observing gesture, timing, micro-adjustments, and ritual interpretation. Knowledge transfer was covert, embedded in performance rather than explicit instruction. The manufactorum operated as a distributed cognitive system, where survival, anticipation, and micro-strategy were shared through observation, memory, and perceptual alignment. Psychological resilience hinged on this negotiation. Successful micro-adjustments reinforced cognition, stabilizing attention, perception, and anticipatory reasoning. Laborers experienced a continuous validation of skill and presence. Each deviation that preserved continuity reaffirmed agency within a system designed to suppress individuality. Obedience became a scaffold for initiative. Ritual, a framework for adaptive cognition, and observation, a conduit for emergent coordination. Life depended on mastering the interface between compliance and microstrategy. Emergent servitor behavior intensified cognitive demands. Minor misalignments, hesitations, and repeated gestures were incorporated into predictive models, allowing laborers to anticipate machine action and environmental hazard. Each micro-adjustment became an element in a feedback loop, where observation, memory, and anticipatory cognition coalesced into continuous operational strategy. Obedience was never absolute. It was a negotiated state, maintained through vigilance, adaptive perception, and disciplined initiative. Memory functioned as both guide and constraint. Historical traces of errors, accidents, and vanished colleagues encoded critical information about the limits of compliance. Laborers integrated this knowledge with real-time sensory input, ritualized patterns, and emergent servitor signals. The edge of obedience was navigated through cumulative experience, observation, memory, and anticipatory cognition combined to preserve continuity while exploiting permissible deviation. Each successful negotiation reinforced perception, skill, and survival. Environmental resonance reinforced the edge. Heat, vibration, and tonal shifts of machinery provided continuous feedback. Laborers synchronized gestures, calibrations, and litanies with these patterns, enhancing anticipation and predictive accuracy. Deviations, whether human or mechanical, produced harmonic shifts in the perceptual lattice, informing micro-adjustments. Collective awareness emerged from this synchronization. Laborers and servitors co-adapted, blending canonical procedure with emergent initiative into operational continuity. Faith-mediated cognitive negotiation, ritual gestures, incantations, and canonical observance provided temporal scaffolding, anchoring attention and stabilizing decisions. Deviations could be framed as interpretive or intensified devotion, mitigating cognitive dissonance while maintaining functional alignment. The manufactorum's flame, steel, and promethium were both hazard and instrument, integrating cognition, ritual, and anticipatory adjustment into a coherent survival strategy. Obedience became interpretive, adaptive, and embedded within ritualized perception. Over repeated cycles, laborers internalized the edge. Micro-adjustments, anticipatory observation, and interpretive ritual became instinctual. Emergent servitor behavior, environmental hazard, and sensory resonance were continuously integrated into cognition. Obedience and initiative were inseparable. One scaffolded the other, creating adaptive intelligence that sustained life amid extreme hazard. Each micro-strategy reinforced memory, skill, and social coordination, producing a resilient lattice of survival cognition. Social networks amplified operational awareness. Skilled laborers transmitted knowledge implicitly through gesture, timing, and adjustment. Novices internalized these patterns through observation and alignment with rhythm, ritual, and environmental cues. Coordination emerged from collective perception rather than explicit instruction, creating a distributed cognitive system capable of sustaining survival and micro-strategy, even under extreme stress. Obedience was collectively negotiated, emergent, and dynamically adjusted within a lattice of shared observation and adaptive practice. Extreme hazard zones magnified the importance of the edge. Thermal surges, molten promethium, and shifting hydraulics demanded continuous vigilance, predictive cognition, and disciplined improvisation. Deviations were carefully measured, embedded in ritual, and coordinated with peers and Microstrategy was anticipatory, interpretive, and socially mediated, ensuring both survival and operational continuity. Life existed at the threshold of obedience, where hazard, cognition, and micro-adjustment converged. Memory, ritual, and observation coalesced into predictive frameworks. Laborers internalized the rhythm of machinery, the behavior of servitors, and the resonance of flame into instinctual response. Micro-adjustments and interpretive gestures allowed navigation of hazard without overt transgression. Emergent autonomy was continuously monitored, integrated, and leveraged, producing cognitive resilience and operational stability. Obedience was flexible yet disciplined, a structure for adaptive presence within the lethal manufactorum environment. By the conclusion of operational cycles, mastery of the edge defined laborer skill, The integration of canonical observance, emergent initiative, ritual, and anticipatory cognition produced adaptive intelligence. Microstrategies reinforced survival, memory-encoded hazard, and observation-mediated coordination with both peers and machinery. The manufacturum's indifference was constant, yet human presence persisted, negotiated at the edge of obedience through disciplined cognition, subtle deviation, and interpretive ritual. Life at the edge was continuous negotiation. Micro-adjustments, anticipatory strategies, and emergent observation enabled survival. Ritual provided scaffolding, memory-encoded hazard, and sensory resonance-guided perception. Obedience was not abandoned, but reframed, integrated into a system of adaptive cognition that preserved both life and agency. The manufactorum demanded absolute fidelity, yet human ingenuity and disciplined initiative persisted, operating at the threshold where obedience met the necessity of survival. The manufactorum endured beyond individual lifetimes, a relentless continuum of heat, metal, and ritualized motion. Its machinery hummed with unbroken persistence, servo arms tracing infinite arcs, promethium conduits searing through steel veins, and hydraulic systems vibrating with ceaseless energy. Laborers emerged, endured, and vanished. Their gestures, litanies, and micro-adjustments absorbed into the operational lattice. Human will persisted only through synchronization with the machinic rhythm, a fragile thread woven into the broader pattern of industrial dominance. Survival was iterative. Each day demanded calibrated precision, anticipatory cognition, and disciplined improvisation. Deviations from canonical procedure were measured, subtle, and socially intelligible, allowing microstrategies to mitigate hazard while maintaining ritual coherence. Memory of accidents, vanished laborers, and minor anomalies reinforced perception and anticipatory frameworks. Life was sustained not in isolation but through engagement with machinery, servitors, ritual, and collective awareness. The manufactorum was both environment and instructor, imposing lethality while shaping cognition. Ritual codified persistence. Gestures, prayers, and repetitive calibrations provided temporal and cognitive scaffolding, aligning human perception with the unyielding rhythm of the environment. Repetition was survival. Each iteration encoded expectation, hazard recognition, and anticipatory adjustment. Litanies became instruments of operational continuity. Gestures, vectors for coordination, and memory embedded into the lattice of observation and perception. Devotion to the omnissiah was inseparable from attentiveness to molten flows, hydraulic pressure, and servitor behavior. Emergent awareness extended through observation and resonance. Laborers attuned to subtle shifts, thermal, auditory, and vibrational interpreted minor deviations in machinery or servitor behavior as signals. Microstrategies proliferated through shared perception, anticipatory gesture, subtle timing adjustments, and interpretive ritual allowed coordinated survival without explicit communication. Collective awareness emerged organically, integrating memory, ritual, environmental cues, and emergent behavior into a continuous operational network. Servitors remained conduits of both hazard and continuity. Programmed obedience was punctuated by micro-anomalies, repetition, or hesitation. Laborers incorporated these signals into predictive cognition, adjusting movement, gesture, and calibration preemptively. The manufactorum's lattice of observation and resonance incorporated both human and machine, producing anticipatory intelligence distributed across flesh and servo frame. Deviations were not disorder, but input, shaping response, survival, and ritual alignment. Extreme zones of heat and kinetic force accentuated the interdependence of human will and machinery. Micro-adjustments, ritual precision, and anticipatory cognition were continuously reinforced. Errors in calibration, lapse in observation, or misalignment with machinery could result in immediate annihilation, reinforcing the necessity of synchronized action. Life required constant vigilance, cognition, gesture, and ritual integrated to maintain continuity, mediating hazard, environmental fluctuation, and emergent mechanical behavior. Memory preserved continuity beyond individual presence. Scorched conduits, misaligned panels, and vanished colleagues encoded operational knowledge into the collective lattice. Laborers internalized these traces, aligning gesture, calibration, and ritual with patterns established by predecessors. Collective cognition became cumulative, emergent behavior, historical trace, sensory resonance, and ritualized observance fused into adaptive intelligence, sustaining operational coherence across cycles of labor and hazard. Faith was the axis of endurance. Liturgy, repeated prayer, and canonical gesture provided stability in the face of environmental indifference. Deviations were framed as interpretive acts of devotion, reconciling emergent microstrategy with ritual expectation. Flame, promethium, and steel were not merely physical elements, but vectors of cognitive alignment, encoding hazard recognition, anticipatory adjustment, and operational intelligence into embodied ritual. Human will persisted through attunement, discipline, and the disciplined modulation of perception, autonomy, and obedience coexisted at the edge of operational necessity. Laborers executed microstrategies while maintaining canonical appearance. Servitors exhibited minor emergent behavior, incorporated into anticipatory frameworks. Observation, memory, ritual, and resonance produced continuous adaptation. Cognitive effort sustained life. Each action integrated sensory input, historical trace, ritualized procedure, and emergent deviation into coherent survival intelligence. Obedience and initiative were inseparable, each scaffolding the other, ensuring continuity within the manufactorum's lethal lattice. The manufactorum's rhythms became perceptual scaffolds. Hydraulic oscillations, promethium hiss, tonal shifts in machinery, and vibration created harmonic signals embedded in labor or cognition. Gesture, ritual, and micro-adjustment synchronized with these cues, producing distributed awareness. Deviations were signals. Anticipation, microstrategy, and collective adaptation were responses. Life depended on attunement, cognition, and disciplined observation, reinforcing the inseparability of human will and mechanical persistence. Emergent networks of laborer perception magnified operational intelligence. Observed gestures, timing deviations, and interpretive ritual transmitted tacit knowledge. Novices internalized harmonic cues, microstrategies, and environmental signals without formal instruction. Knowledge transfer occurred through alignment with rhythm, resonance, and ritual cadence. Collective cognition and operational continuity became emergent properties of shared observation, ritualized interaction, and anticipatory adjustment, embedding survival intelligence within both human and machine. Hazard amplified the integration of cognition and ritual. Molten flows, shifting hydraulics, and servoarm trajectories demanded continuous adjustment, anticipatory reasoning, and interpretive alignment. Deviations were monitored, incorporated, and acted upon within predictive frameworks. Observation, memory, and ritual reinforced resilience, producing adaptive intelligence distributed across the lattice of laborer, machinery, and service. Obedience was never static. It was negotiated dynamically within the constraints of survival and emergent awareness. The psychological imprint of labor persisted indefinitely. Memory of hazard, absence, and procedural error shaped anticipatory frameworks. Laborers internalized these traces, integrating them with sensory resonance and ritual observance. Deviations from canonical procedure were interpreted, incorporated, and transmitted through gesture, timing, and micro-adjustment. Operational continuity depended on this embedded intelligence. Cognition and survival were inseparable, mediated through ritual, memory, observation, and micro-strategy. By the terminal cycles of labor, mastery of resonance, ritual, and anticipatory cognition defined survival. Each action gesture, chant, adjustment, and observation was simultaneously functional, ritualized, and anticipatory. Human will persisted only through alignment with mechanical persistence, collective awareness, and interpretive cognition. The manufactorum operated as a distributed intelligence, fusing flesh, ritual, and machine into an unbroken continuum of survival, hazard mitigation, and operational continuity. Life within the manufactorum was perpetual, cyclical, and unyielding. Human presence was a function of attunement to rhythm, resonance, and hazard. Ritual encoded continuity. Observation integrated emergent behavior. Microstrategy preserved survival. The lattice of cognition, perception, and action extended beyond the individual, embedding adaptive intelligence into the very structure of labor, machinery, and servitor behavior. Obedience and initiative were fused, producing resilience in the face of indifferent industrial dominance. The manufactorum was eternal. Flame, steel, and promethium oscillated with unbroken persistence, encoding cognition, ritual, and operational intelligence into the laborers who traversed its corridors. Human will endured not in isolation, but as part of the lattice, synchronized with machinery, servitors, and ritualized observance. Survival, microstrategy, and faith converged, forming an adaptive continuum of cognition and action. The resonance of labor, hazard, and flame defined existence, ensuring that human presence persisted amid the unrelenting dominance of industrial might. The cycle completed, yet continued. Laborers emerged, endured, and were replaced, their gestures, ritual, and micro-adjustments absorbed into the lattice. Observational awareness, memory, and anticipatory cognition propagated through time, sustaining operational continuity. Flame, steel, and promethium were constant. Hazard, deviation, and ritual persisted. Human will and mechanical persistence intertwined, producing iron eternity, a continuum where cognition, survival, and industrial dominance were inseparable.